Chapter 807. In the pitch-black hall, only a beam of white light shone down from the dome, illuminating the cold marble floor. Several black-robed corpses were strewn all over the floor. Fresh blood flowed out from the sword wounds on their necks and flowed along the circular grooves on the marble floor, forming a strange symbol. The scarlet blood flowed slowly, making this scene look like the evil ritual used to summon demons in legends. When the blood completely merged together, it suddenly seemed to have a life of its own. It flowed against the current and extended to the center of the magic circle, converging into the body of the elegant creature above the magic circle. In the next moment, the white wolf seemed to have gradually awakened from a long slumber. Its body began to move. Then, starting from its head, its snow-white fur began to roll backward, as if a fur coat was being peeled off. First, a beautiful girl's head was revealed. Her long hair was as dazzling as black sandalwood. Then it was followed by a pair of delicate shoulders and milk-white skin. Her delicate curves were revealed to everyone as the fur fell off her body bit by bit. The girl's flawless body finally appeared in front of everyone. Her eyes were tightly closed, as if her soul was trapped in an eternal dream. Only the slight rise and fall of her chest proved that the eldest daughter of Ekis had not truly died. There was quite a commotion in the hall, and some people even breathed heavily. Kohua's eyelashes shook slightly, like the stamens of a flower that had just bloomed. Then she opened her eyes, revealing a pair of silver eyes that were hazy. She got up from the ground lazily, and her long hair that was scattered on the ground was tied up, like a black waterfall flowing against the current. The girl raised her head and looked at the people in front of her with confusion. "Who are you?" The voice was cold and charming, but it was so cold that it was frightening. Dim Kohua, the legendary eldest daughter of Ekis, the ruler of the Proud Moon, and also one of the 12 wolves of the Twilight. It was rumored that she had died in the Battle of Babel Fortress. However, at this moment, this famous name in history was no longer a symbol that could stop children from crying. She had returned to the land of Woned and awakened from her eternal slumber. Arek took a deep breath and suppressed the excitement in his heart. He stepped forward and said, "Lord Kohua, we are all followers of the truth." "Oh," Kohua said softly, "I see. You welcome me back because you want to reactivate the Twilight, right?" "Yes. But I'm still weak. I can't help you." "It's okay, my lord. We have plenty of time. When you break free from the seal under the influence of the great demonic tide, your power will slowly return to its peak." Kohua was a little embarrassed. "But I don't want to." Arek and the high-ranking members of All for One around him were startled and looked at her suspiciously. The girl lowered her eyelids slightly, as if she was a little scared, and replied crisply, "I don't want to participate in the war anymore. Mother promised me that that was the last time I ran before the Twilight. I gave my life for Mother, so I should be free now, right?" She raised her head and looked at the others with misty silver eyes. "Can I leave?" There was a dead silence in the hall. The fourth mark. Fidesel's judgment is not necessarily accurate, but from the day of the signing, it has always been our only reliable choice. The fourth mark increases the bloodline attribute of the holder by the equivalent of 5% of a certain attribute. When the frozen stone door was pushed open, a gust of cold wind blew straight in, making everyone shrink their necks. Brando only then recovered from his thoughts. The fourth mark was a skill he obtained from the second seal of the Fool's Talent. It came from the Wisdom Dragon Crystal. This skill was a bit useless to him. Bloodline was the main attribute of a spellcaster, but his profession was a warrior. The Advanced Templar Knight and the future Guard of Frost Earth had nothing to do with magic. He raised his head, and a valley of ice and snow appeared in his vision. The cold wind whistled in the valley, and the blowing snow and ice made the visibility less than 5 meters. This was the lower area of the White Canyon. Inside was a glacier from the Twilight War era caused by the body of the fallen Milos, the habitat of the Frost Devourer. However, Brando immediately felt a little strange. It was reasonable to say that when the Twilight twins died, the king of the Frost Devourer, Frostfang, should appear nearby. This was the setting in the game, but it was different here. Outside the valley, the north wind was biting cold, but there was no trace of living creatures. "Be careful." Brando tightened his cloak, and had to remind everyone to be vigilant. The exit of the cold walkway was located halfway up the mountain. The team slid down the steep ice wall and came to the bottom of the valley step by step. However, the monsters they imagined did not appear. The valley seemed to be empty, except for the visible world covered with ice and snow and the whistling of the wind. Veronica and the others, who had been warned in advance, looked at Brando as if they were asking. This made him a little embarrassed, but it was not easy to explain, so he kept quiet. Most of the things recorded in the literature have a certain age. Veronica took the initiative to explain to him. The location of the monster's nest is not fixed. Thousands of years is enough for them to wander to other places. Yes, there is indeed such a situation in the literature records. Shido nodded. She was an expert in this field. Brando nodded in agreement, but in fact, he knew that he did not get the information from any literature at all. However, Veronica's words gave him another possibility. Contrary to their guess, the Frost Devourer had not left, but might not have come here to build a nest. After all, this was game time. Before the opening of this dungeon, the disciples of the Black Flames had not yet begun to invade this temple. In fact, there were very few people in Erewhon who knew about this ruin. If that was the case, this path would be much safer. That being said, Brando's heart was still faintly unsettled. In the game, the lower level of the White Canyon was not the first area to be discovered. The players first defeated Sheeta and entered the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator from the main entrance. After defeating the disciples of the Black Flames according to the standard process, they began to explore the fork in the temple. Then the Spiral Hall was discovered, and in turn they entered this glacier, and finally found the cold walkway and the underground entrance to the Holy Cathedral. Some things in the dungeon could be permanently changed. As the order of entry was different, the challenges encountered may also be different. He was thinking about this issue when there was a commotion at the back of the team. He turned around and found that it was the huntress Peya and her brother who had awakened. Brando! A voice came in his mind. Needless to say, this was the voice of the elven lady Saint Tossel. Brando raised his eyebrows, faintly feeling that Saint Tossel was not the only one in the spiritual world. Saint Tossel's voice was a little surprised. You noticed? Seems that you are much sharper than before. The potential in your spiritual power and blood is slowly being unearthed. Compared to the hothead at the beginning, you have changed a lot. Brando knew that she was talking about the days when he had just left Butchie. From that time until the events under the silver mine in Schaflund, he had never noticed that there was another soul in his spiritual world. He was indeed too slow. So who are these two? There should be two spiritual forces next to Saint Tossel, but even if he did not ask, he could vaguely guess the identity of the other party. It's Angeline and Ivan. I don't need to introduce them to you. Both Angeline and Ivan were one of Saint Tossel's personal knights. The former was once known as the Dragon Queen, and was probably the most famous female dragon knight in the history of the Mist Elves, and the latter was the commander of the Whispering Woodland Guards. Unlike the fake Orthless, this was a real expert with a bow. Hello, my name is Brando, and I am currently the successor of Lady Saint Tossel. Hello, Mr. Brando. Hello. The first was a gentle male voice, and the second was a cold female voice. Their answers were also concise and to the point. Their voices were full of unique characteristics, and it was as if one could roughly understand their personalities just by listening to them. Brando suddenly remembered that Saint Tossel once said that the Hunter siblings had her keepsake. If that was the case, then the elder sister and the younger brother both had one each. This was strange. How many rings of the Wind Empress had ended up in Erewhon's hands? Logically speaking, the Ring of the Wind Empress was a national treasure of Saint Tossel. Even if it was lost, it should have ended up in powerful countries such as Cruz or Fanzan. After all, only the nobles of these countries had the financial resources and heritage to collect this level of divine equipment. It's a little strange. Strange? How many rings of the Wind Empress have ended up in Erewhon's hands? Including the one I have, there are already 3. You forgot about Williams's ring. It's now in Maynard's hands. Saint Tossel teased. That doesn't count. Brando shook his head. The elf lady then explained. I asked Elvin. The siblings' ancestors should be the descendants of the Myrna people, and the Highlanders who were expelled from Saint Tossel. Brando suddenly understood. This made sense. The Myrna people had a lot of connections with the Mist Elves. Perhaps they stole the ring and escaped. Of course, it was hard to investigate this. After all, it was something that happened thousands of years ago. So, she and her brother are both your inheritors? He asked. Mr. Brando, they have the potential. But for now, the siblings' strength is still too weak. If it wasn't for His Majesty, we wouldn't have taken the initiative to wake up today. The one who answered was Elvin, but Brando felt that Angelique also nodded. Unless they're in danger? This time Elvin didn't answer. Only Angelique nodded again. Brando understood that Peya was lucky not to die in the ice river. It seemed that it was the Dragon Queen's doing. But what about her brother, Yeruta? Medisha and the others had examined him. Yeruta was seriously injured, and even if he was treated in time, his chances of survival would not be more than 30%. But miraculously, the wound was left at least 1 to 2 weeks ago, and it looked like it had healed naturally without receiving any treatment. Could this also be the work of the heroic souls of these elven sages? Of course, this was not impossible. After all, he had experienced it once in Buchi. At that time, he had activated his unyielding talent and was in a coma. He should have died anyway, but Saint Tossel, the Wind Empress, saved his life. But there was still a question. Why was Peya's brother under the glacier? Wasn't he with Erek and the others? That's what I wanted to tell you, Brando, the elf lady replied. I'm afraid no one can understand his experience. What? Elvin's perception was isolated for a period of time, until just now. To what extent does it take to isolate Lord Elvin's perception? Brando asked keenly. It's not difficult, that teacher of yours can do it. That is to say, it requires at least the power of the extreme realm? Brando's heart skipped a beat. The entire holy cathedral of the Hibernator should not have such a powerful existence. Does he know anything himself? This time he asked Yeruta. I've asked, the child himself doesn't know, or he feels like he's having a dream. Half asleep, he vaguely remembers a voice guiding him forward or something. Saint Tossel hesitated for a moment, but he did mention a blue shadow. A blue shadow? Brando narrowed his eyes slightly. Medisha told me the same thing. Those cruise people told her or told Freya. Brando murmured. He looked up. The wind and snow in the glacier ahead was weaving, but the vague feeling hidden behind the fog was 1,000 times clearer at this moment. He was almost certain that something was leading them here. But it was definitely not the Frost Night King. In the dark hall a pin drop could be heard. Until Erek broke the silence, he replied. I'm afraid not. Why? Kohua looked at the people in front of him, somewhat puzzled. Mother has already promised me. Why are you stopping me? Erek frowned. He never expected to encounter such a situation. Ekis' eldest daughter, the ruler of the Proud Moon, the first wolf to bring disaster and war, was bargaining with him here like a naive little girl, asking him why he wanted to start a war? Shouldn't that be her duty? If it wasn't for the fact that there was no trace of hypocrisy in the other's pure and flawless silver eyes, he would almost think that this lord was joking with him. But the plan had already reached this step, there was no backing down or giving up. Erek exchanged glances with the all-for-one believers around him, then turned back and replied. Because you are Ekis' daughter, this is your duty. Judgment Day is coming, and you are the first wolf to wake up from the dusk. But I don't want to. Kohua replied timidly. I'm afraid it's not up to you, Lord Kohua. Erek sighed and replied gloomily. The girl was frightened by him and took a step back, but a red light net immediately flashed behind her, causing her to bump into it. This was some kind of magic seal. She struggled a little in panic and found that she couldn't break free. Being sealed for a long time had caused her strength to drop by many levels. If it were in the past, she would only need to blow a breath to break this kind of seal. But now she couldn't do anything. She turned back and looked at the others with some fear. What do you want to do? But at this time, Erek had already taken out a black crystal ball from under his robe. I didn't expect it to come in handy. To be honest, I don't want to owe those guys a favor. The Duke shook his head and raised the crystal ball. When Kohua saw that thing, her expression immediately changed. She stared at the annoying human in front of her with wide eyes and shouted in panic. That's my soul fragment. Why is it in your hands? The girl's face was pale and she almost trembled. Erek's expression didn't change, but he respectfully replied. Please forgive this one's offense, Lord Kohua. No. Brando was talking with Saint Tossel when he suddenly remembered something. He stopped talking and seemed to have fallen into his own thoughts. The elf lady in his spiritual world was keenly aware of this silence and asked, "What's wrong, Brando?" "Nothing, I just thought of something." Brando pondered for a while before answering. "What is it?" "One of Ekis' daughters is resting in this temple." "Dim Ko Hua, Ekis' eldest daughter, didn't you mention it before?" "Is that so?" Brando shook his head indifferently, but he was thinking of something else. Ko Hua had the title of double goddess in the game, because the battle between the players and her would repeatedly go through 2 stages. In these 2 stages, Ko Hua's temperament would also repeatedly switch between a pure and innocent girl and the evil eldest daughter of Ekis. To be honest, the kind Ko Hua had a lot of fans among the players, but this in itself wasn't surprising. Most of the boss battles in the Amber Sword were strange, and there was more than one boss with dual personalities. But the reason why he thought of this was because some people thought that Ko Hua's evil state wasn't her true nature. Among the players who had experienced Ko Hua's battles, there was a saying that when Ko Hua was in her evil state, she was actually being manipulated. But this saying didn't have any basis, and Brando once thought that it was just a self-deception by those fanatical fans. But he suddenly thought of the voice that had led everyone to the temple, the blue shadow, and couldn't help but feel a chill down his spine. That thing had signed some kind of contract with Sheeta in a certain era, but even Sheeta himself couldn't tell what kind of existence it was. Who was it and what was its purpose? Brando could only think of the title of the Awakening God. But what was the Awakening God, and why did it summon them here? The more he thought about it, the more he felt that this might be a trap. But unfortunately, there was no room for retreat now, or else as long as Arek activated the star-shaped gem in his hand, everyone would turn to ashes with the forest. What kind of bad luck is this? Brando was a little speechless. Oh. Chapter 808. Hee. In the pitch-black hall, only a beam of white light shone down from the dome, illuminating the cold marble floor. Several black-robed corpses were scattered on the floor. Blood flowed out from the sword wounds on their necks, flowing along the circular grooves on the marble floor, and forming a strange symbol. The scarlet blood flowed slowly, making this scene look like the evil ritual used to summon demons in legends. When the blood completely merged together, it suddenly seemed to have a life of its own. It flowed against the current, extending to the center of the magic circle, and converging into the body of the elegant creature above the magic circle. In the next moment, the white wolf seemed to have gradually awakened from a long slumber. Its body began to move. Then, starting from its head, its snow-white fur began to roll backward, as if a fur coat was being peeled off. First, a beautiful young girl's head was revealed. Her long hair was as dazzling as black sandalwood. Then, a pair of delicate shoulders and milk-white skin were revealed. The curves of a stunner were revealed to everyone bit by bit as the fur fell off. The girl's flawless body finally appeared in front of everyone. Her eyes were tightly closed, as if her soul was trapped in an eternal dream. Only the slight rise and fall of her chest proved that the eldest daughter of Ekis had not truly died. There was quite a commotion in the hall, and some people even breathed heavily. Ko Hua's eyelashes shook slightly, like the stamens of a flower that had just bloomed. Then she opened her eyes, revealing a pair of silver eyes that were hazy. She got up from the ground lazily, and her long hair that was scattered on the ground was tied up, like a black waterfall flowing against the current. The girl raised her head and looked at the people in front of her with confusion. "Who are you?" Her voice was cold and charming, but it was also a little frightening. Dim Ko Hua, the legendary eldest daughter of Ekis, the ruler of the proud moon, and also one of the 12 wolves of the twilight. It was rumored that she had died in the Battle of Babel Fortress. However, at this moment, this famous name in history was no longer a symbol that could stop children from crying. She had returned to the land of Woned, waking up from her eternal sleep. Arek took a deep breath, suppressed the excitement in his heart, and stepped forward. "Lord Ko Hua, we are all followers of the truth." "Oh," Korfa replied softly. "I see you're welcoming me back because you want to reactivate the dusk, right?" "Yes. But I'm still weak. I can't help you." "It's okay, my lord. We have plenty of time. When you break free from the seal, your power will slowly return to its peak under the influence of the great demonic tide." Ko Hua was a little embarrassed. "But I don't want to." Arek and the high-ranking members of All for One around him were startled and looked at her suspiciously. The girl lowered her eyelids slightly, as if she was a little scared, and replied crisply, "I don't want to participate in the war anymore. Mother promised me that that was the last time I ran before the twilight. I gave my life for Mother, so I should be free now, right?" She raised her head and looked at the others with her misty silver eyes. "Can I leave?" The hall was dead silent. The fourth mark. Fidesel's judgment is not necessarily accurate, but from the day of the signing, it has always been our only reliable choice. The fourth mark increases the bloodline attribute of the holder by the equivalent of 5% of a certain attribute. When the frozen stone door was pushed open, a gust of cold wind blew straight in, making everyone shrink their necks. Brando only then recovered from his thoughts. The fourth mark was a skill he obtained from the second seal of the Fool's Talent. It came from the Wisdom Dragon Crystal. This skill was a little useless to him. Bloodline was the main attribute of a spellcaster, but his profession was a warrior. The Advanced Templar Knight and the future Guard of Frost Earth had nothing to do with magic. He raised his head, and a valley of ice and snow appeared in his vision. The cold wind whistled in the valley, and the blowing snow and ice made the visibility less than 5 meters. This was the lower area of the White Canyon. Inside was a glacier from the Twilight War era caused by the body of the fallen Milos, the habitat of the Frost Devourer. However, Brando immediately felt a little strange. It was reasonable to say that when the Twilight twins died, the king of the Frost Devourer, Frostfang, should appear nearby. This was the setting in the game, but it was different here. Outside the valley, the north wind was biting cold, but there was no trace of living creatures. "Be careful." Brando tightened his cloak, and had to remind everyone to be vigilant. The exit of the cold walkway was located halfway up the mountain. The team slid down the steep ice wall and came to the bottom of the valley step by step. However, the monsters they imagined did not appear. The valley seemed to be empty, except for the visible world covered with ice and snow and the whistling of the wind. Veronica and the others, who had been warned in advance, looked at Brando as if they were asking. This made him a little embarrassed, but it was not easy to explain, so he kept quiet. Most of the things recorded in the literature have a certain age. Veronica took the initiative to explain to him. The location of the monster's nest is not fixed. Thousands of years is enough for them to wander to other places. Yes, there is indeed such a situation in the literature records. Shido nodded. She was an expert in this field. Brando nodded in agreement, but in fact, he knew that he did not get the information from any literature at all. However, Veronica's words gave him another possibility. Contrary to their guess, the Frost Devourer had not left, but might not have come here to build a nest. After all, this was the game time. Before the opening of this dungeon, the disciples of the Black Flames had not yet begun to invade this temple. In fact, there were very few people in Erewhon who knew about this ruin. If that was the case, this path would be much safer. That being said, Brando's heart was still faintly unsettled. In the game, the lower level of the White Canyon was not the first area to be discovered. The players first defeated Sheeta and entered the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator from the main entrance. After defeating the disciples of the Black Flames according to the standard process, they began to explore the fork in the Holy Cathedral. Then the Spiral Hall was discovered, and in turn they entered this glacier, and finally found the cold walkway and the underground entrance to the Holy Cathedral. Some things in the dungeon could be permanently changed, and with the order of entry, the challenges encountered may also be different. He was thinking about this issue when there was a commotion at the back of the team. He turned around and found that it was the huntress Peya and her brother who had awakened. "Brando!" A voice came in his mind. Needless to say, this was the voice of the elven lady Saint Tossel. Brando raised his eyebrows, faintly feeling that Saint Tossel was not the only one in the spiritual world. Saint Tossel's voice was a little surprised. "You noticed? Seems that you are much sharper than before. The potential in your spiritual power and blood is slowly being unearthed. Compared to the hothead at the beginning, you have changed a lot." Brando knew that she was talking about the days when he left Butchie. From that time until the events under the silver mine in Schaflund, he had never noticed that there was another soul in his spiritual world. He was indeed too slow. So who are these two? There should be two spiritual powers next to Saint Tossel, but even if he did not ask, he could vaguely guess the identity of the other party. It's Angeline and Ivan. I don't need to introduce them to you. Both Angeline and Ivan were one of Saint Tossel's personal knights. The former was once known as the Dragon Queen, and was probably the most famous female dragon knight in the history of the Mist Elves, and the latter was the commander of the guards of the Whispering Woodland. Unlike the fake Orthless, this was a real expert with a bow. Hello, my name is Brando, and I am currently the successor of Lady Saint Tossel. Hello, Mr. Brando. Hello. The first was a gentle male voice, and the second was a cold female voice. Their answers were also concise and to the point. Their voices were full of unique characteristics, and it was as if one could roughly understand their personalities just by listening to them. Brando suddenly remembered that Saint Tossel once said that the Hunter siblings had her keepsake. If that was the case, then the elder sister and the younger brother both had one each. This was strange. How many rings of the Wind Empress had ended up in Erwin's hands? Logically speaking, the Ring of the Wind Empress was a national treasure of Saint Tossel. Even if it was lost, it should have ended up in powerful countries such as Cruz or Fanzan. After all, only the nobles of these countries had the financial resources and heritage to collect this level of divine equipment. It's a little strange. Strange? How many rings of the Wind Empress have ended up in Erwin's hands? Including the one I have, there are already 3. You forgot about Williams's ring. It's now in Maynard's hands. Saint Tossel teased. That doesn't count. Brando shook his head. The elf lady then explained. I asked Elvin. The siblings' ancestors should be the descendants of the Myrna people, and the Highlanders who were expelled from Saint Tossel. Brando suddenly understood. This made sense. The Myrna people had a lot of connections with the Mist Elves. Perhaps they stole the ring and escaped. Of course, it was difficult to investigate this. After all, it was something that happened thousands of years ago. So, she and her brother are both your inheritors? He asked. Mr. Brando, they have the potential. But for now, the siblings' strength is still too weak. If it wasn't for His Majesty, we wouldn't have taken the initiative to wake up today. The one who answered was Elvin, but Brando felt that Angelique also nodded. Unless they're in danger? This time Elvin didn't answer. Only Angelique nodded again. Brando understood that Peya was lucky not to die in the ice river. It seemed that it was the Dragon Queen's doing. But what about her brother, Yeruda? Medisha and the others had examined him. Yeruda was seriously injured, and even if he was treated in time, his chances of survival would not be more than 30%. But miraculously, the wound was left at least 1 to 2 weeks ago, and it looked like it had healed naturally without receiving any treatment. Could this also be the work of the heroic souls of these elven sages? Of course, this was not impossible. After all, he had experienced it once in Bucci. At that time, he had activated his unyielding talent and was in a coma. He should have died anyway, but Saint Tossel, the Wind Empress, saved his life. But there was still a question. Why was Peya's brother under the glacier? Wasn't he with Erek and the others? That's what I wanted to tell you, Brando, the elf lady replied. I'm afraid no one can understand his experience. What? Elvin's perception was isolated for a period of time, until just now. To what extent does it take to isolate Lord Elvin's perception? Brando asked keenly. It's not difficult, that teacher of yours can do it. That is to say, it requires at least the power of the extreme realm. Brando's heart skipped a beat. The entire holy cathedral of the Hibernator should not have such a powerful existence. Does he know anything himself? This time he asked Yeruda. I've asked, the child himself doesn't know, or he feels like he's having a dream. Half asleep, he vaguely remembers a voice guiding him forward or something. Saint Tossel hesitated for a moment, but he did mention a blue shadow. A blue shadow? Brando narrowed his eyes slightly. Medisha told me the same thing. Those Cruz people told her, or they told Freya. Brando murmured. He looked up. The wind and snow in the glacier ahead was weaving, but the vague feeling hidden behind the fog was 1,000 times clearer at this moment. He was almost certain that something was leading them here. But it was definitely not the Frost Night King. In the dark hall a pin drop could be heard. Until Erek broke the silence, he replied. I'm afraid not. Why? Ko-hwa looked at the people in front of him somewhat puzzled. Mother has already promised me, why are you stopping me? Arek frowned. He never expected to encounter such a situation. Ekis' eldest daughter, the ruler of the proud moon, the first wolf to bring disaster and war, was bargaining with him here like a naive little girl, asking him why he wanted to start a war? Shouldn't that be her duty? If it wasn't for the fact that there was no trace of hypocrisy in the other's pure and flawless silver eyes, he would almost think that this lord was joking with him. But the plan had already reached this step, there was no backing down or giving up. Arek exchanged glances with the all-for-one believers around him, then turned back and replied, "Because you are Ekis' daughter, this is your duty. Judgment Day is coming, and you are the first wolf to wake up from the dusk." "But I don't want to," Ko-hwa replied timidly. "I'm afraid it's not up to you, Lord Ko-hwa." Arek sighed and replied gloomily. The girl was frightened by him and took a step back, but a red light net immediately flashed behind her, causing her to bump into it. This was some kind of magic seal. She struggled a little in panic and found that she couldn't break free. Being sealed for a long time had caused her strength to drop by many levels. If it were in the past, she would have been able to break this kind of seal with just a breath, but now she couldn't do anything. She turned back and looked at the others with some fear. "What do you want to do?" But at this time, Arek had already taken out a black crystal ball from under his robe. "I didn't expect it to come in handy. To be honest, I don't want to owe those guys a favor." The Duke shook his head and raised the crystal ball. When Ko-hwa saw that thing, her expression immediately changed. She stared at the annoying human in front of her with wide eyes and shouted in panic, "That's my soul fragment. Why is it in your hands?" The girl's face was pale and she almost trembled. Arek's expression didn't change, but he respectfully replied, "Please forgive this one's offense, Lord Ko-hwa." "No." Brando was talking with Saint Tassol when he suddenly remembered something. He stopped talking and seemed to have fallen into his own thoughts. The elf lady in his spiritual world was keenly aware of this silence and asked, "What's wrong, Brando?" "Nothing, I just thought of something." Brando pondered for a while before answering. "What is it?" "One of Ekis' daughters is resting in this temple." "Dim Ko-hwa, Ekis' eldest daughter, didn't you mention it before?" "Is that so?" Brando shook his head indifferently, but he was thinking of something else. Ko-hwa had the title of double goddess in the game, because the battle between the players and her would repeatedly go through 2 stages. In these 2 stages, Ko-hwa's temperament would also repeatedly switch between a pure and innocent girl and the evil eldest daughter of Ekis. To be honest, the kind Ko-hwa had a lot of fans among the players, but this in itself was not surprising. Most of the boss battles in the Amber Sword were strange, and there was more than one boss with dual personalities. But the reason why he thought of this was because some people thought that Ko-hwa's evil state was not her true nature. Among the players who had experienced Ko-hwa's battles, there was a saying that when Ko-hwa was in her evil state, she was actually being manipulated. But there was no basis for such a statement, and Brendel had once thought that it was just a self-deceiving statement from those fanatical lovers. But he suddenly thought of the voice that had led everyone to the temple, the blue shadow, and couldn't help but feel a chill down his spine. That thing had signed some kind of contract with Sheeta in a certain era, but even Sheeta himself couldn't tell what kind of existence it was. Who was it and what was its purpose? Brando could only think of the title of the Awakening God. But what was the Awakening God, and why did it summon them here? The more he thought about it, the more he felt that this might be a trap. Unfortunately, there was no room for retreat now, or else as long as Arek activated the star-shaped gem in his hand, everyone would turn to ashes with the forest. What kind of bad luck is this? Brando was a little speechless. Oh. Chapter 809. Until they crossed the entire glacier, the king of the Frost Devourer, Frostfang, which should have existed in the game, never appeared. There were only some frost wraiths in the snow. These undead creatures were said to be born from the souls of the travelers who had frozen to death under the glacier. They were similar to ghosts, but looked like ice demons that roamed the snow-covered forest. Fortunately, they were not very powerful, and the little female dragon, Brando, and Veronica easily dispatched them. They did not even need the Ash Sword Saint to do anything, and the Shire Trio certainly gained a lot of EXP. The small monsters in such a large-scale dungeon were also very rich in EXP and loot. It was a pity that Brando's luck had been ruined when he got the elapsing needle today. None of the dozens of frost wraiths dropped anything good. Not even a high-level white equipment. Brendel felt like crying. It would have been worth it if he had gotten a whole set of elapsing needles, but it was only half of it. It was too unfair that he still had to lose some of his luck. After crossing the glacier, the team once again entered the belly of the mountain through a cave hidden in the valley. Under Brando's guidance, they turned into a long artificial corridor. It was as if a spectacular painting had suddenly appeared before everyone from the sky. It was a magnificent temple embedded in the belly of the mountain, hundreds of feet high, with arched beams opening up a towering trapezoidal space. The temple followed the architectural style of Milos's wreckage that they had seen on the surface, but beams of sky-blue light hung down from the dome of the temple like sharp swords that were hundreds of feet long, sprinkling on the blue ice, crisscrossing with the slanted beams to form disorderly and picturesque shadow patches. The temple was so majestic, as if it was a giant sandwiched in the belly of the mountain, independently supporting both sides of the glacier. When they walked out of the narrow corridor, they could only feel that they were as small as dust. Everyone could not help but exclaim in their hearts. Even Brando, who had read the description in the guide, was shaken at the moment. This was the Eternal Extinction Square, and further back was the Spiral Hall. This was the creation of the civilization from the previous era. The square was still echoing with the tragic cries from that war. Then everything fell silent, leaving only the silence of the tens of millions of years later. What's that? It was not known when the little prince had run to the front. He curiously stared at the groups of blue light balls cruising in the square below and asked, "Breath of Frost." Those were the activation spells that had been awakened from the ancient battlefield by the dark magic power. However, the number of activation spells was astonishing. From one end of the square to the other, there were at least 1,000 of them. They were scattered like stars in the night sky. Veronica couldn't help but feel a little troubled when she saw this scene. This kind of ancient activation magic was quite difficult to deal with. If there were only a few dozen of them, it would be easy to deal with, but there were thousands of them. Even if she and the Ash Sword Saint attacked together, along with the little female dragon and Brando, she was afraid that they would be drowned. Kill them directly? Veronica took a deep breath. The scene in front of her also proved that the ancient war was tragic. How dense the explosion of magic was needed to cause so many activation spells to gather here thousands of years later. There was another ancient battlefield in Wonde. That was the place where the four sages and the dark dragon had the final battle. Today that place was called the Deadland. A large number of activation spells were active in that place, but the number was not as ridiculous as here. The battlefield spanned dozens of miles, and there were only a few hundred activation spells wandering around. But here, Veronica could not help but shake her head. "I'm afraid it will take a few days to clean up all of them. We don't have that much time. The Spiral Hall is behind us. At this time, Arek and the others should be here soon. We have to be one step ahead of them." Brando immediately replied, "I'll lure these things away. I'll give you a signal later and you guys will go through the square." No. Brando was slightly startled. When he turned around, he found that the ones who objected were the little female dragon and Medisha. The little female dragon looked at him up and down, and replied with some dissatisfaction, "You are my toy. Before you act on your own, shouldn't you ask for the master's opinion first?" Medisha, on the other hand, was more worried. "My lord, your identity is different from before. There is no need to take the risk yourself. As a superior, you have to learn how to do things." Brando raised an eyebrow. Why did this line sound so familiar? He looked at the Silver Elf Princess and asked, "What else did Amandina say to you?" The Silver Elf Princess' face turned red. She stammered, No, this is what I wanted to say." Brando looked at the red-faced Medisha and couldn't help but find it funny. He probably didn't expect the little elven princess to have such a side. He was about to comfort her, but at this time Veronica also spoke. Her opinion was similar to Medisha's. "Brando, you are not the strongest among us. The little princess is right. Leave it to me or Mephisto." Brando shrugged and directly ignored the little female dragon's previous nonsense. As for Veronica's question, he had his own opinion. In fact, it wasn't as dangerous as imagined. It was just luring the monsters. If a pure warrior who had more than 100 levels in the game didn't even know how to do this, then he might as well buy a piece of tofu and kill himself. Moreover, luring away these icy breaths here was a very famous technique. Players used to farm materials here. This was a necessary method. Although Brando hadn't personally tried it, he couldn't say that he didn't know how to do it. But it didn't mean that Mephisto or Veronica couldn't learn this technique. In fact, it wasn't difficult. The problem was that this technique required a prerequisite, and that was to be familiar with the terrain. And among everyone present, only he could reluctantly say that he was qualified to meet this condition. And there was no room for mistakes. Once surrounded by thousands of icy breaths, even Mephisto would not be able to escape easily. If that happened, it would turn into a direct battle, then there would be a lot of fun. Just like Veronica said before, it would take a few days to finish. So in the end he shook his head. Master Veronica, Master, it's not difficult to lure these monsters away. But do you know where to lure them? I know because I am more familiar with this place than you. Let me try first. Don't worry if it's troublesome, I will find a way to return. How will you return? Brando's perfunctory words obviously couldn't fool the crew's Legion commander. This lie was not easy to tell. Brando hesitated for a moment before replying. It's hard to say, I will find a way myself. Veronica stared at him suspiciously. Brando sighed and had to explain. Master Veronica, please don't worry. Do you think I am the kind of person who doesn't care about his own safety? Well, maybe I can give it a try for Erwin, but I am not that noble to work for you cruise people, so please believe me, okay? This statement finally moved the female Legion commander, although it sounded a little unpleasant. Even Prince Lenoret couldn't help but snort coldly, thinking that Brando's statement was too arrogant. Since when did the cruise people need the help of Erwin people? Veronica looked at him deeply and replied in a deliberately cold voice. That's true. There is still a gap between a sly little guy like you and those who flaunt self-sacrifice, although you often pretend to be so bewitching. Brando couldn't help but smile bitterly. He knew that Veronica was talking about the scene that happened in the Loop of Tradewinds, but at that time, he really didn't have the intention to sacrifice himself for the druids or the tree elves. He just wanted to find a way to survive in a desperate situation. He looked back and saw that most of the cruise people who were not familiar with this experience were at a loss, but a few of his subordinates were secretly laughing, especially the Silver Elf Princess, who smiled especially sweetly. But in any case, Veronica finally didn't object. He looked back again and his teacher, the Ash Sword Saint, also didn't say a word. He just nodded slightly to him and replied lightly, Since this is what you asked for, then be careful and have more opportunities to train yourself. This is also a good thing for you. Brando raised his eyebrows. He had to admit that his teacher was also a strange person. Perhaps breaking out of the encirclement of tens of thousands of monsters was not a big deal for him. After all, he was the one who made a bloody path out of the encirclement of the central area of the crew's empire. There was no comparison at all. After all, there was no lack of people at Veronica's level who had participated in the ambush back then. Compared to these people, the threat of Frost Breath was only slightly stronger than a pet dog. Thinking of this, he shook his head and gestured to his wizard servant not far away. The Shire, come with me. Luring monsters was a skill. Although he could do it alone, it was still a bit difficult with his current strength. It would be a different story if he had the help of a wizard. The key was that the Shire was his summon creature. If there was any danger, he could reset him at any time. If he brought someone else with him, it would be more or less a hindrance at the critical moment. And the most important reason was that he didn't want Veronica to know some of his little secrets. In the face of his lord's summons, the Shire could only sigh. He spread his hands as if he had already expected this. Anyway, as long as it was hard work, he would be indispensable. My lord, I didn't owe you anything in my previous life. It's hard to say, but I think I probably owe someone. Brando replied somewhat helplessly. Someone? The young wizard looked back and found that Brando had just taken a step when someone's hand tightly grabbed the corner of his clothes. Brando helplessly turned back and met Scarlet's bright and somewhat worried eyes. You wait for me here, Scarlet, I'll be right back. Oh no, it should be that we'll meet on the other side right away, okay? Brando felt that the phrase right away was a bit too unlucky. Why would he come back? so he quickly changed his words. However, the red-haired girl looked at him and shook her head seriously. That was not good. The detection range of the breath of ice was about 30 feet, and the perception of the activation magic was very poor. Furthermore, his level was higher than the theoretical entry level of the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator, so Brendel only stopped when he was about 25 feet away. The Shire followed closely behind. A wizard's stealth ability was far inferior to a warrior's profession, not to mention compared to Nightingale. However, magic could solve this problem. He used the law of sound absorption to completely eliminate the sound of his footsteps, so his steps sounded lighter than Brando's. Then it was Scarlet. Brando couldn't persuade the mountain girl, so he had to let her follow. Fortunately, Scarlet's strength was not weak, and she had dragon blood. It would be difficult for her to hide her voice in front of those monsters who were good at detection, but it was not a problem for a half-deaf, half-blind thing like the Frost Breath. Just that, Brando looked back again and saw the sneaky faces of Alaz and Sheeta. "What are you doing here?" Brando stared at them angrily. "I'm afraid I'll lose my toy." Alaz's answer was natural. "She caught me." Sheeta replied, wanting to cry but without tears. Brando was a little speechless. If he had known, he would have just taken everyone to break out of the encirclement. These 4 or 5 people together to lure the monsters was simply a fantasy. He had to fiercely gesture to Alaz. "Listen to my command later." "What's with your attitude?" The little female dragon seemed very dissatisfied, but after a while she added, "But if there's a reason, I can still consider it." Brando snorted softly, hiding behind the first beam, and pointed to the beam on the other side and said, "See over there, the frost breath attacks by rays, with a range of about 120 feet. They move by flying with a movement speed of about 15 feet per second. However, we have 5 chances to avoid their pursuit through the beam, so if your own explosive speed can't reach more than 12 feet per second, just obediently retreat." With that, he looked back at the others. But Alaz looked at him as if he was an idiot. "What are you looking at?" "Of course it's a question." Brando replied. "Are you an idiot? We're dragons." The little female dragon replied snappily. "We can run faster than you even if we walk." "Him too." Brando used his chin to point to the little fatty beside Alaz. "My lord, although I don't like to exercise, I'm still faster than you no matter what." Sheeta stuck out his little belly and replied in a low muffled voice. Brando couldn't help but touch his face, feeling that it was a bit of a blunder. The giant dragons were the golden people, and a combat-oriented race. Their physical fitness was naturally not for show. He just kept the habit of being a leader and asked subconsciously but forgot about this. He looked at Scarlet again. The mountain girl did not answer, but the other party was half-dragon, so naturally there was no need to say more. He had to turn his attention to the Shire. "My lord, I have a dimensional gate." The wizard servant pondered for a moment and replied with a smile. "So I'm still the slowest?" Brando suddenly felt a little embarrassed. "Well, more or less." The Shire looked at the others. Alaz and Sheeta were giant dragons. Scarlet could also be said to be half a dragon, and he himself had magic, so it seemed that the Lord was indeed holding them back. "How about it, little Brando?" Alaz seemed very happy to see Brando deflated, and couldn't help but giggle. "Now you understand, we're here to help you. Without this young lady's help, I'm afraid it will be very difficult for you to complete this mission. This is secondary. If you were to be killed by these flies, then wouldn't the toy that I had painstakingly obtained be gone? This is very bad." Brando knew that the little female dragon was deliberately going against him, as if she had been holding a grudge ever since she knew that he gave the golden apple to Scarlet. But he suddenly thought of a plan. "Alaz, how about we make a bet?" "A bet?" The little female dragon narrowed her eyes, and subconsciously became a little vigilant. "Well, what I want to say is to lead these monsters away so that others can pass. It's not as simple as you think. If you think that it's enough as long as you're fast enough, then you're gravely mistaken. And I can tell you, even if it's speed, you can't compare to me here." Brando replied. "So, I suggest that you and Sheeta go back and act with the others, and leave this to the professional personnel department. Don't give me that, I'm not going to be provoked by you." Alaz snorted. "But how do you want to bet?" Brando snickered. This little female dragon did not mean what she said, and he had already experienced it. He quickly replied, "Didn't I say let's compete in speed to see who gets to the finish line first? Competing in speed with the dragon race?" Allah's eyes widened. "Are you crazy?" Brando nodded seriously. "The loser must unconditionally agree to a condition of the winner." "A condition?" The little female dragon was slightly startled, and suddenly hugged her chest, her little face red, and shouted with some anger. "What are you trying to do, shameless? F***ck, what are you thinking about?" Brendel almost screamed when he saw the little female dragon like this. He hurriedly put up a finger and gestured for her to keep quiet. Then he poked his head out to take a look. Fortunately, the icy breaths that were cruising outside did not seem to notice the noise here at all. It was indeed worthy of the title of being half deaf and half blind. He breathed a sigh of relief, turned back, and scolded Alaz angrily. "Are you crazy? Do you want to die here?" Alaz looked at him hatefully, showing her fangs, and retorted, "Who told you to make such a shameful request?" "How is it shameful?" Brando suddenly saw the Shire and Sheeta's strange expressions, as well as Scarlet's blushing face. He wanted to strangle this stupid little female dragon to death. "I mean, if I win, you have to give me the real heart of the dragon." When Brando said this, he paused for a moment. After all, the heart of the dragon was the secret treasure of the Dragon Clan, and he did not know how valuable it was to the Dragon Clan. It was just that Princess Magadol needed to rely on the heart of the dragon to revive, so he came up with this idea in a hurry. Sure enough, as soon as he opened his mouth, Sheeta hurriedly shook his head. "The heart of the dragon is mine." But unfortunately, Alaz looked at him suspiciously and asked, "That's it?" "Okay, I agree." "Sister Alaz." The little fat dragon widened his eyes. "It's okay, you can join in too." Alaz patted her cheap brother's shoulder and said casually, "This way, if he loses, he owes each of us a request." "You can do that?" The Shire was stunned, and he quickly raised his hand. "Then I'll join in too." Brando looked on coldly, watching his young wizard servant digging his own grave, and could not help but sneer in his heart. But he was also curious and asked, "What kind of wager do you want?" Because in Brando's impression, the Shire seemed to be the kind of person who was indifferent and carefree. Unless it was necessary for magic research, he did not seem to have any other desires. "That's nothing, but I think it's cool. Isn't it? Think about it, your master owes you a request, it's so dirty and unreasonable." The Shire could not help but answer with a smile. Damn. Brando was speechless at his servant's strange idea. But when he turned around, he saw Scarlet's face was red, and she raised her hand. "You want to join in too?" "Yes." "Damn." For a moment, Brando could not help but have such a thought in his mind. This was indeed very dirty and unreasonable. Chapter 810. Happy Birthday, Kitty. Blackie's new book, Calamity Descends, will be on the shelves on National Day. Everyone who is short on books can go and take a look. If you like it, you can also subscribe and give monthly tickets. In addition, you don't have to worry about the updates of the book anymore. It may not be 100% stable every day, but it certainly won't be a monthly update. Equals a smiley face while Brando was making his bet. Duke Arek and his party had already passed through the central maze under the lead of Ko Hua. The road ahead was getting wider and wider, gradually forming a cave-like corridor inside the mountain. Those corridors were hundreds of feet high, and the pillars with a diameter of more than 30 feet supported the pillars that looked like the ribs of giant beasts. Looking up, these majestic pillars were embedded into the walls on both sides. The hall was not empty. The prehistoric battle had extended to this place, causing the empty walkway to be filled with skeletons of all sizes. These skeletons were still in the state of battle when they were alive. It was as if a tragic battle had been interrupted by a sudden disaster, and all the participants were frozen in the last moment of their lives. The bones filled the entire space, forcing Arek and the others to meander through the gaps between them. He was bypassing a skeleton with wings. The skeleton was still wearing a half-body armor covered with silver wings, but the armor that used to shine had lost its magic brilliance and turned into a pile of rusty copper and iron. This was the corpse of a divine servant, a seraph. This kind of golden race was completely wiped out in the Battle of Ebabel. The remaining few people hid outside the elemental frontier and disappeared with the gods. Today, there were still some secondary divine descendants in Wonde, but compared with these terrifying and beautiful creatures, they were not the best among the silver race. Duke Erek noticed the skeleton of the giant wolf that fought with the seraph. The third vertebra of the skeleton's skull was obviously white. This was a typical third-generation Twilight wolf, the offspring of Fenrir. They and their ancestors had been imprisoned by the divine people, and the place where they were chained was left with a permanent mark that went deep into the bone marrow. Erek withdrew his gaze from these skeletons and narrowed his eyes. Where is this place? The promenade of meditation. Where does it lead to? The place you want to go. Erek turned around. Beside Devard, Ekis' eldest daughter was shrouded in a black robe. The surface of the robe had some scarlet patterns, and the black fabric made her skin shine like snow. The hood was so deep that only her sharp chin could be seen. However, the pair of red eyes shone in the shadows, and the cold glint could still be clearly felt. When Erek did not speak, Kohua pursed her lips and did not say a word. Ever since she absorbed the other half of the soul fragment, she had become like this. She was no longer as pure and innocent as before. However, only when Erek looked away would the girl's face reveal a pained expression. She frowned. Erek could faintly feel that the eldest daughter of Ekis had not forgotten everything. Those stinking demons from the Sulphur River gave him her soul fragment and told him that this thing could make the unruly Kohua obedient. However, the latter was neither unruly nor obedient. Although she did calm down and lead them out of the maze. Lady Kohua. Erek thought for a moment and spoke with a hoarse voice. Kohua looked at him. Do you still remember what happened in this war? What does this have to do with you? I just want to pay my respects to that great war. The girl raised her head and looked around the hall with cold eyes. This is Main's subordinate. When the offspring of Fenrir attacked the promenade of meditation, they collided with the 7th Legion of the Seraphs. They fought here as you can see. And then? There is no then. The dying Milos activated the central core, and the light of death shrouded the entire battlefield in an instant. Main Mare and I, as well as the third column of the No Race and their commander, were forever frozen at this moment. The Frost Giants lost their father forever, and the Twilight Legion also suffered heavy losses. The central core. It should still be somewhere around here, but you can rest assured that it should also be severely damaged and will no longer pose a threat to you. Erek nodded and no longer spoke. However, there was a rare surge in his calm heart. He could imagine what kind of war it was. The No Race, the offspring of Fenrir, the Seraphs, the Frost Giants, the most terrifying names of the ancient era were all turned into dust in an instant. Even an existence like Kohua was no exception. This was the Twilight Legion. Thinking of this, he could not help but respectfully bow his head. Lady Kohua, please forgive us for our previous offense. It's fine. Under Kohua's hood, there was no fluctuation in her blood-red eyes. She glanced at the human in front of her, without joy or worry. But in the depths of her eyes there was a blazing light. Oh, perhaps even Brando would not know that the Central Defense Corps of the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator had such a glorious past. In his memory, it was just one of the bosses in the Holy Cathedral, and its strength was not even as strong as the Twilight Gemini's battle. The core was located in one of the halls in the central labyrinth. Before the players reactivated it, it would only be silent under the dust forever, and even the central core in its activated state was nothing more than that. And at this moment, Brando was fulfilling his bet. Wait. Allah's voice was hurried, but it was very pleasant to the ears. She stared at Brando. You are not allowed to use that thing you got earlier. So she still remembers the elapsed needle. At least you're not that stupid. I'm not crazy enough to burn experience points for a bet. Brendel thought to himself. You're not that stupid. Other items can't be used either. Alaz added. You're too nosy. Is this how you make a bet? You're trying to cheat. Alaz revealed a pair of sharp canine teeth, as if she would bite Brando if he did not agree. Brando had to raise his hands in surrender. Okay, you have the final say. The little female dragon was smug, feeling that she had prevented Brando from being sneaky. With her own ability, she did not think that Brando could get ahead of her. She was a dragon, and the strongest of the dragons, the gold dragon. Although she was not as fast as the blue dragon, she would not lose to a human. But immediately she knew how big a mistake she had made. It turned out that the core of this bet was to pass through the monsters, and not simply to compare who was faster. The little female dragon realized this with despair. Thousands upon thousands of icy breaths. Even a dragon wouldn't dare to touch them lightly. Every time she wanted to move forward, those little bits of revitalizing spells gathered together like a wall, blocking her way forward. Alaz naturally did not dare to dive in like this. She had no choice but to go around. Fortunately, Brando pointed out 6 pillars to them that could be used to bypass these revitalizing spells. Otherwise the little female dragon would have gone crazy. If she did not follow the route pointed out by Brando, she found that she could not move forward even half a step. However, the cunning human was able to slip through the gaps between the monsters every time. Even at such a close distance, only a few frost rays hit him. For the sake of fairness, each of them had the Shire's frost barrier on them, and these few frost rays hit Brando. It had no effect at all. Damn, there's a constant dimensional anchor in this place. The Shire's strange cry came from nowhere. In short, except for Scarlet, the remaining 1 person and 2 dragons were somewhat crying. The young wizard servant finally knew why his lord looked at him with a smile that was not a smile. It turned out that he was looking for his own death. However, he couldn't figure out how his lord knew that there was such an obscure enchantment spell like dimensional anchor in this place. Brando was laughing secretly. Alaz would never understand what the problem was. In fact, before someone invaded, the frost breaths were naturally distributed throughout the square. Since it was naturally distributed, the huge amount of frost breaths could not lie evenly on every inch of the ground. And the fact was that before being stimulated by external objects, most of these revitalizing spells were actually grouped together in groups of 3 or 5, but because there were too many of them, it looked like the whole square was everywhere. In other words, there were still 1 or 2 fixed cutting routes. These classic cutting routes were also summed up by the previous players from repeated failures. Only after thousands of failures could a pattern be found, and no matter how smart or talented Alaz was, it was impossible to find the only correct path among thousands of frost breaths at a glance. But Brando could. This was the advantage of having an information lead or cheating. He took the lead and cut into the only correct route, and then broke into the group of frost breaths, like poking a hornet's nest. Although Brando's speed was not too fast or too slow, it could be said to be just right, almost blocking the reaction speed and shooting distance of the frost breaths. So these revitalizing spells were almost helpless against the fly that passed between them. But have you ever seen an angry bee swarm? These frost breaths were the same at present. Although their reaction was very slow once they moved, the huge number was extremely terrifying, especially when Brando deliberately disrupted their pace, causing them to jam together behind him. Countless revitalizing spells were in a mess behind Brando, and Alaz, Sheeta, and the Shire, who were also behind Brando, could only grit their teeth at this moment. Before the frost breaths moved, they could not find the path through them, let alone after they moved. In front of them, the frost breaths were like restless waves, and anyone who wanted to plunge headfirst into them would probably end up with nothing left of their bones. Alaz walked forward for this distance, and could only stop and stomp her feet. Brando, you damn cunning human! The little female dragon waved her claws and roared at Brando's back from afar. Brando pretended not to hear. He was bypassing the last pillar, and at the same time threw 2 stones into the 2 piles of frost breaths not far away. This action was no different from poking a hornet's nest, and the revitalizing spells over there immediately fell into a frenzy and chased in his direction. He looked back again, and the revitalizing spells in the middle and front of the hall had been left behind by him for a long time. Except for the sporadic attention attracted by Alaz and the Shire, most of them were led in his direction. If he remembered correctly, there were 2 exits to the north of the Eternal Extinction Square, and the eastern exit led to the central maze. He intended to lead these frost breaths there first. But there was a problem here. First, there were 2 giant revitalizing spells at the exit. With his current speed, it was difficult to avoid the opponent's attack. Second, after these revitalizing spells were led over, how could he turn back? It was not that there was no way in the game, but he was a warrior, not a nightingale known for her agility. In fact, this was the difficulty of the whole monster luring technique, but Brando knew that most of the techniques of that era had some flaws. For example, he himself had modified a lot of meaningless action paths. For himself, he was still very confident. After all, He was a warrior with a pure profession over level 100. If his agility was not enough, he would rely on experience to make up for it. Looking back again, the frost breaths clustered together were closer, but the huge number limited their forward speed. Brando estimated that the revitalizing spells on the left and right were a bigger threat to him. In fact, at this time, several cold rays were shot at him from both sides, but Brando gently leaped and let all the attacks fall behind him. He crossed the hall horizontally and came near the last pillar. He raised his head, and the eastern exit was close at hand. Near the exit in that direction, there were two giant revitalizing spells. Those things looked like an enlarged version of the frost breaths, each at least 60 or 70 feet in diameter. Around their bodies there were some dazzling blue spots like orbiting satellites, but Brando knew that it was their attack method, so he deliberately avoided some. But in any case, in the end, he still had to pass through the middle of the two frost breaths. There was no shortcut. He could only rely on the county. He immediately sank his consciousness into the world of his mind and ordered, "The county." The long line of people in black robes stopped in front of a quaint door. The door was also made of the obsidian material that could be seen everywhere here, but it was covered with star-like textures. In the center of the door, the stars surrounded a star, and there was only a groove left in the position of the star. Everyone looked up at the giant door, which was 120 feet high. There were two skeletons by the door, each holding an ice-blue giant axe, their heads hanging down, and their helmets split in two. "These are the frost giant forbidden guards?" Devard's voice hissed. Erek nodded. "We're here. Behind this is the spiral hall," Kohua replied coldly. The Duke turned his head, and the black-robed knight of all for one came into his sight. "Find a way to open this door, and the others guard this hall." He took a breath and his heart finally stirred. The plan had finally reached the last step, and success was in sight. But Erek suddenly narrowed his eyes and noticed that the promenade of meditation led to a dark corridor. He glanced over there and asked, "What direction is that?" The hall was silent, and no one answered his question. He had to turn his head to Ekis' eldest daughter. The latter looked at him silently. "Eternal Extinction Square. Where is that?" "I don't know." Kohua shook her head, as if she really didn't know. "You don't know? But I know that the main brothers escaped in that direction. Why, you don't believe me?" Kohua looked at Erek with her blood-red eyes, and her eyes were calm without the slightest fluctuation. Alec furrowed his brows. "Devard," he ordered, "take some people there and have a look." Kohua didn't seem to care about the other's order. She turned her head and quietly looked at the giant obsidian door in front of her. Chapter 8:11. Freya woke up groggily from the cold. However, she was no longer in a glacial valley that looked like layers of ice blades. She could no longer hear the low whistling of the icy wind in the valley. She remembered that when she fainted, she was on the windward side of the glacier. Now, she was in a valley with a calm wind. She did not know how long she had been unconscious. The cold seemed to have seeped into her limbs and bones. She gritted her teeth and struggled to get up from the snow. However, Freya suddenly noticed something that she had never seen before. Not far from her wobbling vision stood a small creature. It looked a little like a small snowman, but its slender arms were not made of dry branches. Instead, they were made of ice crystals. The little creature placed its hands on its waist and bent over to look at Freya. It looked a little like the butler in the seigneur's castle. However, it was not tall. Its face was covered with a beard and eyebrows that looked like ice crystals. Under the eyebrows, a pair of bright eyes shone brightly. Freya was shocked. She had never seen such a thing before. She immediately woke up and sat up in the snow like a spring. However, she did not expect that her sudden movement would scare the snowman. The little creature was so scared that it took 2 steps back and tripped on a tree root. It then fell on its butt in the snow. It took a long time for it to get up. Then the two of them stared at each other. There was an awkward silence in the snow. After a long while, Freya finally realized that the snowman did not seem to be hostile. She pondered for a moment and asked tentatively, "Did you bring me here?" The snowman was startled. It quickly patted the snow off its body and stood up. It bowed respectfully to Freya and said, "No, it was not me. It was my master who brought you here, my dear young mistress." could even speak crew's language. However, its intonation was a little weird. It sounded like a duck quacking, which was very funny. Freya's mouth opened in an O shape. She was shocked by the way the snowman addressed her. Wait, what did you call me? Who's your master? Master is master, respected little master. The snowman answered in a matter-of-fact tone, as if that was the correct answer to this question. Wait, I'm not a little master. Did you get the wrong person? Master said that you are the most distinguished guest here. Master told us to treat you with the etiquette of a young master. Master said so, so master must be right. Freya felt that her brain was not enough. She only felt that if Brando was here, he would be able to figure out what was going on quickly. However, the girl from the countryside of Bucci was not stupid. She first touched the side of her belt, where the Lionheart sword was still in its scabbard. She then touched her waist pouch, where the slate Brando had given her was also intact. Even the ruby ring was still on her finger. She heaved a sigh of relief. This meant that the other party had no ill intentions. She calmed down a little. After a while she asked the snowman, "Hello, how should I address you?" The snowman put one of his withered hands on his chest and bowed at her like a human being. "We are the Talifin sprites who have lived here for generations. My honorable little master, we do not have names. You can call us Hey or Come Here. After all, we all look the same to you, but there are actually some differences. You only need to count our beards and eyebrows carefully, and you will find that there are more and less of them, and their shapes are not the same either." Before Tolfin finished its introduction, Freya burst into laughter. The little thing was imitating the etiquette of the human nobles, but its words were irrelevant. It was a little funny. She held back her laughter and asked, "Where is your master?" "Master is in the house." "House? Can I see him?" "Master said that if you wake up, little master, I should take you to see him." "Take me to see him?" Freya was a little suspicious. "Can I see him now?" Tolfin nodded. Freya stood up in the snow and patted the corner of her clothes, only to realize that she had recovered from her injuries. She remembered that she was seriously injured before she passed out and killed the silver monster with the last blow. She could not remember what happened at that time. She only vaguely remembered that the slate in her bag fell out and glittered in the snow, and she was in pain as if she had fallen into a furnace. Then she passed out. However, the stone slab was still in her waist pouch. She pinched it with her hand, and it was as cold as before. There was no change at all. Freya did not know if the recovery of her injuries had something to do with the changes at that time or the mysterious master of these fairies, but she saw that the little snowman had climbed to the mouth of the valley in front of her. It stood under a snow-white thorn bush and waved at her. Freya hurried to follow it. Freya found that she seemed to be in a secluded valley. She followed Tolfin through a dense forest of white thorns that she had seen before. The whole valley seemed to be covered with this kind of plant. These white thorns could grow very high, just like the trees outside, except that the top of the thorns bent down and hung glowing fruits. Like street lamps, the soft light illuminated the winding path in the forest. There were many animals in the white forest. Freya saw a type of squirrel with grayish-white fur. It was searching for shrubs and seeds under the thorny bushes. Occasionally, it would pass through the path in a group, or it would look at her with its big black eyes, wary of an outsider. On the thorns above her head, there were many birds that looked like sparrows, but these birds had silver feathers and long tail feathers. They were not afraid of strangers at all, and let Freya and the fairies walk under them. Instead, they tilted their heads and looked at the uninvited guest. After walking for a while, the white thorns suddenly separated to the left and right. Freya's eyes lit up slightly, and a look of surprise appeared on her face. After the thorns separated, a mountain spring surrounded by the forest appeared behind. The mountain spring hung down from the rock wall and fell into a pool. Steam rose from the pool. It was obviously a hot spring formed by geothermal heat. But this wasn't enough to surprise her. She saw that the ground beside the hot spring was covered with emerald green vegetation and meadows. And on the meadow there was a blue stag lying down. The stag obviously noticed her too. Freya did not know if she was hallucinating, but she saw the stag looking at her with a kind expression. This made her recognize the stag immediately. It was the stag that led them out of the predicament the night before. She seemed to have understood something, But at this moment Tolfin, who was leading the way, stopped and turned back to look at Freya. The surprised girl looked ahead and saw that the white thorny trees had come to an end. In front of them was an open space in front of a mountain wall. A man-made structure was carved out of the mountain wall, forming an arch that was as tall as 3 or 4 people. Freya looked at the arch and then at Tolliver, who had stopped, and asked, "Do you want me to go in?" The snowman nodded. Freya had to pluck up her courage and take a few steps forward into the cave. The light around her dimmed, but after adapting to the dim environment, she gradually saw the interior of the cave. Behind the arch was a natural cave, as if the man-made hatchet marks on the outside were just to decorate the entrance of the cave. Like most glacial caves here, the walls of the cave were made of smooth ice, but the cave was not deep. It extended for 20 or 30 feet before it stopped abruptly, cut off by a vertical ice wall. Freya could not help but widen her eyes. Where was the master that the little sprite mentioned? There was nothing in the cave. But just as she was puzzled, the ice wall in front of her suddenly melted and formed a small door, and then a voice said, "Please come in, Miss Freya." "You know me?" Freya asked, startled. But the voice did not answer. Freya was nervous and curious. She was actually very worried about the safety of Brando, Maynard, and the little prince at the moment, but she did not know where she was. She waited for a while and saw that the voice had no intention of continuing, so she had to bend down and pass through the small door in the ice wall. The thick ice wall was about 10 feet thick. After passing through the small door, she suddenly felt a light in front of her, and the surrounding temperature rose a few degrees. It was not as cold as before in the valley, but there was a warm atmosphere. Freya looked up in surprise and found that behind the ice wall was a very comfortable room. It was like the study rooms of the nobles she had seen in Ampere Seal. There was a table, a high-back chair, a bookshelf, a fireplace, a thick carpet on the floor, and a bright flame burning in the fireplace. The bookshelf was full of books, and there were silver candlesticks and plates on the table. The candlelight was soft, and the plates were filled with all kinds of food. The food was steaming hot, as if it had just been taken out of the oven. The room was empty, but someone automatically pulled out a chair for Freya and put a plate and fork on it, as if inviting her to take a seat. "Please have a seat." That voice rang out once more. Freya knew that if she did not do as the other party said, the voice would probably ignore her again. She hesitated for a moment and sat down. Immediately, a white porcelain teacup automatically flew down from the shelf next to her and placed in front of her. Then the silver teapot on the table seemed to be held up by an invisible hand, tilted slightly, and poured tea for her. The tea was a beautiful red like the onyx in the cup. Freya was a little nervous. She put her hands on her knees and suddenly remembered what she had learned in etiquette class. She said subconsciously, "Thank you." The voice seemed to have seen through the girl from the countryside of Bucci and couldn't help but laugh. "Don't be nervous," he said. "Don't be nervous. It's been a long time since we entertained guests here." Freya took a deep breath. She didn't know what he meant by, "It's been a long time since we entertained guests." Did it mean that this place used to entertain guests? Or did it mean something else? She asked, full of doubts. "Hello, are you the owner of this place? Did you save me?" "We'll talk about this later. Try the tea I made first," the voice replied gently. Drinking something of unknown origin in a completely unfamiliar place was not a wise thing to do, but Freya felt that there was no need for the other party to do this. She hesitated for a moment, but still patiently picked up the white porcelain teacup and took a sip. The black tea was very delicious. It had a strong taste of milk. After entering her mouth, she felt as if all the fatigue in her body had disappeared. Even the soreness from sleeping in the snow had disappeared without a trace. But she was not in the mood to drink tea. She only took a sip and put down the cup with both hands with a heavy heart. "How is it?" the voice asked. "And very good. Thank you for your hospitality," Freya said, choosing her words carefully. "You seem to be very worried?" Freya was not an idiot. She could now confirm that the other party was the owner of this place. "Because I don't know where this place is. I'm very confused. This is just a place because it is not fundamentally different from other places. If you seriously consider this question, you will realize that it is not important to you, right?" the voice replied. Freya felt that this statement was very strange, but it could not be said that it was wrong. What she really cared about was not where she was, but how far away she was from Brando and Maynard. She nodded honestly. Yes, I'm worried about my companions. I've been separated from them. Sorry, I'm not saying this to trouble you, but can you help me get out of here? She paused. Or you can ask the sprites. No need to rush, the voice said. Miss Freya, no need to rush. I led each of you here because I want you to do me a favor. You are the one leading us. Freya thought of the stag she saw outside the door and could not help but believe it. But who are you and how can we help you? My power is very weak, but it is not difficult to lead you here because I know why you are here, so I just need to tell you the direction. The voice laughed. Long story short, after all, I don't have much time left. Let me introduce myself first. My name is Melandel, according to the Kurlut's name, Milos. The teacup in Freya's hand fell on the tray. She did not even notice the tea splashing on the tablecloth. Before coming here, she had never even heard of this name. But soon this name was deeply engraved in her memory, just like the glaciers and wind in this forest. Brendel's words echoed in her heart again and again, shocking her to the point where her jaw dropped. You are right. I am the first frost giant in this world. They call me Father and you humans call me God. I accept all these titles because I am qualified to do so. But, Freya wanted to say, but ever since the stars fell to the ground, the gods had already left this world. Legend had it that they left with the Twilight Dragon and never returned. Although people had built many shrines to them in Vaunt to commemorate the era when gods and humans coexisted, everyone knew that the era of mortals had long since arrived. But she couldn't bring herself to say it out loud. She was stunned by the sudden news. Are you confused? The voice seemed to know what she was thinking. Freya calmed herself down and nodded. Actually, you don't have to be so surprised. Milos has already fallen. I am just a myth left behind by a great will. Myth? People's thoughts will repeatedly linger on the question they wanted to solve the most when they were alive. This myth will occasionally become a ghost-like existence, but if your existence is too strong, this kind of thinking will become substantial, like an existence like me, the voice replied gently. Are you saying that there is a problem that is bothering you? But shouldn't gods be omniscient and omnipotent? Perhaps only Lady Martha can be omniscient and omnipotent. We just think more than you. But my myth has nothing to do with you. It is just unnecessary trouble. But today I want you to do me a favor. Freya, this matter is not only related to me, but also to you and your companions, and the young master of Valhalla. I know him, don't I? Brando. Freya was so shocked that she almost stood up. The voice did not answer, but Freya had a strange feeling that the other party nodded silently. What do you want me to do? Freya could only ask cautiously. Although she felt that there must be some kind of mistake, how could she help with a problem that even the gods were troubled by? The room was silent for a moment. I want you to stop my resurrection. After a while, the voice slowly spoke. What? Freya bounced up from the chair as if she had been electrocuted. It was as if she had heard the most unbelievable thing since she was born. Her face was full of shock. What did you say? Stop my resurrection, Freya. That great will is gradually waking up from the darkness. You don't understand what will happen. But for the entire Wond, this is an unpredictable fate. The era of gods has ended. This has nothing to do with the myth. I don't know the answer to that question, but the Knight of Azure has given you an answer. This answer can no longer be changed, Freya. P.S. I continue to recommend Idiot Sunspot's new book, Calamity Descends. Speaking of which, this one has been doing quite well in the past few days. This one will continue to work hard. Chapter 812. To celebrate the release of Blackie's Calamity Descends, update support, there should be a surprise today. I hope everyone supports Blackie as much as they support me. Thank you. The Shire. Brando finally lured the two giant revitalizing spells. Countless brilliance floated from the giant revitalizing spells, making them look a bit like stars in the dwarf stage. Gravity could no longer restrain the burning gas around the star. The inner layer began to collapse, and the hot atmosphere began to expand violently outward. These two light balls almost occupied the size of the end of the square when they expanded violently, and the inside of their bodies flashed with dazzling blue light. The gap between the two giant revitalizing spells was only the size of a carriage, and the gap was shrinking rapidly. Brando accelerated wildly, trying to pass through the middle before it was completely sealed. He activated the charge skill and jumped up from the ground. The narrow passage was almost in front of him, but at this moment, the revitalizing spell's body floated with a layer of flowing light, and they spun like a star ring and crashed into Brando. At this time, countless twisting lines of the law extended from Brando's body, forming two solid walls of light in front of him. The flowing light hit the walls of light heavily, and the lines of the law shook violently, flashing with dazzling light. At that moment, Brando's figure suddenly split into a phantom, and the wall of light behind him was quickly shattered. The sky was swallowed by the brilliance, but he had landed firmly on the ground. Looking back, the giant revitalizing spells were behind him, and countless icy breaths chased him into the star-like light body. Like moths to a flame, they left a bright spot in the expanding light ball and then disappeared. Brando paused for a moment, then put away his sword and ran to the east exit. On the south side of the square, the changes in the entire Eternal Square were visible. The Kurlutzian nobles were shocked and fearful, shocked by Brendel's strength and fearful of their previous arrogant attitude, while Lenarette frowned and did not say a word. Even Veronica raised her eyebrows. She did not expect Brendel to really lead so many monsters away. Putting herself in his shoes, even if she were to replace Brendel, she would still have to think about what to do. The Count is so powerful. Shido muttered to herself in disbelief. That's just a trick, Veronica said and shook her head. It was indeed a skill, but the problem was that not many people could see through the gaps between thousands of monsters at a glance. Even she could not. It was not until she saw Brando shuttling through the sea of monsters with ease that she followed the little guy's path and found the safe path. But until now, she still did not know whether this path was the only one, or one of many paths. No matter which it was enough to frighten her. If it was the former, then she couldn't imagine how Brando could find the only way out in an instant. If it wasn't, then it meant that the encirclement of these monsters was full of holes in Brando's eyes, and she needed a lot of time and consideration to find even one of them. Veronica looked at the north side of the square with some complicated feelings. Although she was very reluctant to admit it, the young man's intelligence and courage still amazed even herself, and could even be said to be a little uneasy. That young man was an heroine, and the most determined heroine she had ever seen. The female Legion commander lowered her eyelids, and for a moment she could only think that there were many outstanding young people in this generation of Cruz's people, but compared to Brando, it was like comparing the bright moon to a firefly. If only there were such young people in Cruz's people, how good would that be? She shook her head gently. Brando certainly did not think that Veronica would misunderstand his actions and overestimate his ability. In fact, the icy breath wrapped together like a tide made him not have the heart to think too much. He was beginning to feel that the problem was beginning to become a little tricky. The square gradually turned into a towering promenade in his vision that led to an unknown area. This direction should be the promenade of meditation, the exit of the central labyrinth, a very famous area in the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator. If he remembered correctly, there was an unknown hall not far ahead. The area of the hall was not much smaller than the Eternal Square. And the valuable thing was that there were no wandering monsters. It was almost a natural place to move, and Brando planned to turn there. But the problem was that this time he had pulled too many monsters. Before this, it could be said that no one had tried to pull all the icy breath and two giant revitalizing spells in the Eternal Hall together. The more monsters there were, the slower it would be to turn, and he didn't want to be surrounded by monsters when he turned back. But after thinking about it, he couldn't find a reasonable way to avoid it. He didn't want to use the elapse pointer. Although the bet was over and it wasn't considered cheating, it was still painful to burn experience. Especially since he had just activated his elemental activation, it wouldn't be fun if he fell below the realm. But Martha seemed to be on his side this time. Just when he couldn't figure it out, a little light suddenly appeared in the darkness in front of him. Brando's heart skipped a beat. It was naturally impossible for there to be players in this dungeon, and the disciples of the Black Flames had not yet entered the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator at this time. Apart from them, the only ones moving in this holy cathedral could be Erek and the members of All for One, but he didn't know who it was or if it was Erek himself. But no matter who it was enough for Brando. He immediately had an idea. After receiving Eric's order, Devard led the black-robed knight to patrol along the long hall. The hall in this direction was different from the promenade of meditation. The black hall was empty, and there were long arched windows embedded in the walls. When the team passed by these giant arched windows, they looked as small as ants. Inside the arched windows were windows made of thousands of years-old glaciers. Faint blue light penetrated from behind the ice walls and crisscrossed in the hall. Just a few minutes ago they had turned a corner and seen such a spectacular view. But as to where this place was and what this hall was called, no one knew. The team moved forward slowly, passing through the light and shadow. The sound of footsteps intertwined into a hollow echo at the other end of the hall. The sound reverberated in the open, enclosed space. After a moment, a black-robed knight suddenly stopped and shouted, "What is that?" Everyone followed his gaze and looked forward. They saw a stream of light suddenly gushing out from the darkness. The stream of light was gradually brightening, like a glowing behemoth waving its tentacles. It appeared from behind the corner in front of them. The tentacles slowly extended forward, and then its body appeared in the vision of Devard and the other knight behind him. Everyone's eyes widened. They saw two huge light balls, one in front and one behind, occupying the space of the promenade, and were pressing in this direction. "It's an revitalizing spell." Devard was knowledgeable and recognized the origin of the other party at a glance. But he had never heard of such a big revitalizing spell. He turned his head and saw that the knight beside him was panicking and pulling out his sword. He hurriedly slapped the other party's sword away and shouted at the other party, "What are you doing? Run!" Most revitalizing spells were formed by spells between the 3rd and 9th circle, and revitalizing spells formed by spells above the 9th level were generally called wandering magic. Because they were formed by pure and powerful magic power, any magic would only have a healing effect on wandering magic, except for spells such as Dispel Magic and Spell Disassembly. Revitalizing spells were incorporeal creatures with no physical existence and only energy form. Mortal physical attacks could only cause very limited damage to them. Therefore, although the strength of wandering magic itself was not yet at the level of elemental activation, it was one of the most terrifying existences among the monsters at the peak of gold level. And the two in front of them could no longer be called wandering magic. Even though Devard had only seen revitalizing spells twice in his life, he still recognized them at first glance. These were wandering magic lords formed by spells above the 10th circle, and did not have the slightest bit of fake elemental level strength. Only wizards and mages and hunters of the same level could fight against them. No matter how many swordsmen or black-robed knight of all for one there were, they would only be fodder. "Run, let's run separately. There are only two of them. One of us will be able to return to the Grand Duke's side." Devard immediately shouted at the others. The black-robed knight seemed to have woken up from a dream and hurriedly scattered and retreated. But just as Devard's voice fell, countless specks of light appeared in the darkness. "Sir, look over there!" someone exclaimed. In fact, there was no need for the other black-robed knight to remind him. Devard had already seen this scene. Countless icy breaths appeared in the darkness, like a sudden wave of monsters. How is this possible? Devard's first reaction was that they had unintentionally activated some kind of trap. Otherwise, these revitalizing spells in the temple would not have rioted for no reason and come straight for them, until someone next to him reminded him. "Someone!" The knight on his left suddenly shouted. "Someone is leading them here." The Highlander Eagle swordsman was slightly startled before he realized the meaning of this sentence. He immediately looked in that direction, but it would have been better if he did not look. What he saw made his nose crooked. "It's you!" Devard immediately roared out with almost no tolerance. The expression on his face was full of resentment, as if he had seen an irreconcilable enemy. In the face of such an eagle swordsman, Brando felt a little wronged. He even felt that this was too much of a coincidence. The first time they met, he cut off one of the eagle swordsman's hands. The second time they met, this guy almost died on the battlefield. And this time, it was obvious that something this gentleman did not want to see was going to happen. Brando felt very sorry for this Highlander swordsman, but this did not stop him from saying, "Mr. Devard, has your hand grown back? Count Tonagel, you deserve to die." Brando could feel the anger on Devard's gloomy face. If this anger could be materialized, then he would have been riddled with holes by now. But unfortunately, the eagle swordsman was far from practicing the skill of killing people from thousands of miles away. So Brando could still be alive for a while. Of course, we can't doubt Mr. Devard's courage. If he could, he would definitely pull out his sword and cut Brando into 8 pieces. Or at least, he would die together with Brando to avenge his previous humiliation. But now, Devard felt as if his legs had grown roots and weighed more than 1,000 pounds. Not to mention rushing up to kill Brando, it was difficult to even take a step forward. Because Brando was leading the 2 giant wandering magic lords behind him, and the tide-like icy breath of the revitalizing spell was coming straight at them. As long as one's intelligence was still intact, they would understand what this Count Tonajul was planning. After all, it was not a great plan to divert the trouble away. But the problem was, Devard found that there was only one way to deal with this despicable plan. Despicable bastard! He cursed and turned around, and gave the most invulnerable order to deal with the current situation. Retreat! Brando laughed in his heart. Just as Devard had realized, he had already planned this. What both sides had to do now was to have a hearty race. They didn't need to run fast, they just needed to be faster than the others. But it was not so easy for Devard to be one step ahead of him. He snapped his fingers and used his index finger to draw in the air. The retreating black-robed knights suddenly felt their feet soften, and the originally solid ground seemed to have turned into mud. Lesser Quicksand, a First Circle Earth Elemental Series spell. Its only function was to make the ground softer. Because the effect of the spell was on the ground and not the people walking on it, the black-robed knight did not even have the chance to resist this spell with their magic resistance. Under normal circumstances, there was no need to resist this spell, because it only made the ground a little softer. It was not like the real quicksand spell, which could even make you lose your footing and sink into it. Making the ground a little softer could only be used to restrict the cavalry on the battlefield. Even this effect was almost negligible, because the effective range of the spell was too small. Unless it was cast by hundreds of wizards at the same time, it was completely meaningless in a battlefield that was easily a few miles wide. But if there were hundreds of wizards, wouldn't it be better to cast some other spells to deal with the cavalry? Even the effect of this spell on the black-robed knight was minimal. Although their speed was inevitably slowed down on the soft ground, the change in speed was minimal and did not affect the overall situation. Devard heard someone snort softly. Obviously, they were a little disdainful of Brando's childish spell. If it was half a year ago, he might have had the same idea. Using a First Circle spell to deal with the existence of elemental awakening? Wasn't this just wishful thinking? But now alarm bells were ringing in his heart. Would the opponent be easy to deal with? Just ask him about the scars on his arms. What happened next immediately confirmed his thoughts. Airflow entanglement, wind of disorder, secondary rust, ice feet, flame chains, accelerated exhaustion, and slight increase of gravity. One circle spell after another fell on everyone's heads. The effect of each spell was minimal, but the advantage was that it did not require casting time. Brando was almost running while throwing these low-level spells at the black-robed knight. He did not need to successfully break through the black-robed knight's magic resistance every time, but as long as it worked once, these high-grade believers of all for one would slowly and uncontrollably slow down. On normal days, this kind of slowing down was almost meaningless because the duration was short, and it was equally time-consuming and laborious. But at this moment, for all the black-robed knight, it was a death sentence. Brendel passed by the knights who were slowed down by him one by one, and the giant roaming magic lord behind him in countless icy breaths swallowed them up in an instant. They were like pebbles thrown into the sea, swirling around in the tide of monsters and disappearing without a trace. Despicable! These high-grade believers of all for one were usually the most insidious, cunning, and ruthless existences in the eyes of ordinary people, but at this moment in their hearts Brando was the real demon. The nine-headed phoenix had an old saying, "Help the devil do evil." And now Brando was playing such a role in their minds. If it was only Brando, they could easily defeat him if they joined forces. Of course, this was what the black-robed knight thought. But unfortunately, Brando obviously would not give them this opportunity. He would only cast spells on them one by one, and then let the icy breaths behind him kill them one by one. This was simply a blatant attempt to intimidate others by intimidating others. Of course, There were also a few black-robed knights who could not bear the humiliation. They drew their swords and turned back, wanting to rush up and perish together with Brando. But unfortunately, they soon realized such a problem. It turns out that this guy is an elementalist who has been holding back, but his swordsmanship is surprisingly good. Then, with such a surprise thought, they were swept into the group of monsters behind by Brando's 9 luminaries' sword art. The knights were reduced one by one, and soon only Devard was left in Brando's vision. And this eagle swordsman was indeed a Rex confidant. Brando felt that he might have some kind of magic equipment like the Talisman of Meditation or the Brooch of Secondary Spell Resistance. When the first and second circle spells hit him, they disappeared without a trace. He tried to release a third circle fire arrow, and as expected, he staggered and left a charred mark on his back. It was indeed the Talisman of Meditation. The Brooch of Secondary Spell Resistance could resist spells below the fourth circle, but Brando still shook his head. He only knew the third circle spell, Fire Arrow, and his magic power was not enough for him to use it repeatedly. After all, it was impossible to rely on a third circle spell to kill an elemental-activated opponent. If only he had a third circle wind bind. As long as he could delay for a second, it would be enough for Devard to suffer. Brando had to face the reality that he was a third-rate elementalist. Not to mention, it was already very difficult for him to cast a second circle spell instantly, and this was thanks to his high will. If he forced a third circle spell to be cast instantly, he might not be able to withstand the backlash. And if he wanted to stand still and cast a spell, he would have to ask the army of frost breaths behind him if they were willing to stop and wait for him. The answer was obviously no. Now Brando had to face two problems. 1. Devard ran faster than him. 2. He seemed to have no way to slow down his opponent. And obviously, our eagle swordsman also understood this after Brando tried a few times. He could not help but show a proud look on his face for the first time. Although he was a little embarrassed, he still turned back and mocked Brando loudly. "You're crazy, do you know what you're doing? Do you plan to keep running like this? Haha, then you'll definitely die before me." After Devard shouted this sentence, he only felt a burst of joy in his heart. It was as if this was the first time he had the upper hand against Brando. But this kind of pride died in his stomach before he could completely show it on his face. Even the slight clue that he revealed instantly froze on his face. He saw Brando looking at him with some pity. If anyone else looked at him like this, he would definitely feel angry, insulted, and belittled. But when Brando looked at him like this, alarm bells rang in Devard's heart. He must be plotting something. He must be planning to scheme against me. Devard was too familiar with this young man in front of him. Although they only knew who the biggest beneficiary of the whole Ampere Seal peace conference was after the battle in Ampere Seal, the other party single-handedly plotted their defeat, as if he could predict the future, and played them, including the Duke he respected, in the palm of his hand. If there was anyone in this world that could be regarded as a demon, then the other party's appearance must be the same as the face in front of him. Devard felt goosebumps all over his body at that moment. He concentrated on Brando's every move, as if Brando made the slightest move, he would immediately counterattack with countless rehearsals in his mind. But Brando only made one move. He mouthed a sentence to him. Our eagle swordsman was slightly startled. It was not that he did not know how to read lips, but what Brando said to him was too strange. "Be careful in front." Be careful of what? Oh. Chapter 8:14. Devard got up from the ground in a daze and finally understood what Brando meant by being careful of the front, the corner of the corridor outside the nameless hall, which they passed by when patrolling. He ran almost at full speed, and then hit the wall that was harder than steel. Brando seemed to be reminding him, but in fact he was trying to divert his attention. When he realized it, he had already suffered a big loss. Brando passed by Devard, took a few steps forward, and then stood against the wall. The army of revitalizing spells behind him was less than 100 feet away, but closer to Devard. "What do you want to do?" Devard looked at Brando shakily, not understanding why he suddenly stopped. "Watch the show. Watch the show." As soon as Devard's voice fell, he saw Brando take out a long sheet from his backpack. Oh no, it should be a gray cloak, but this cloak was too big and too long, it looked more like a giant's thing. Devard was slightly startled, and suddenly felt that this thing was somewhat familiar. Then he saw Brando lift the cloak over his head, covered from head to toe, and disappeared completely. "No, you devil!" Devard immediately understood Brendel's intentions. He roared angrily and looked back, and his face turned pale. Two roaming magic lords were standing in front of him like two towering mountains. "No, I will never let you succeed, Count Tonagel." Devard was extremely angry. He stood there motionless, and even if he died, he did not intend to lead these revitalizing spells away. The giant revitalizing spells that were like stars continued to move forward, and the tentacles that exuded soft light swept across the entire hall like a river of stars. Devard's face turned green and white. He was indifferent at first, but when the tentacles swept over his head with a buzzing sound, his face changed. "Save me, or I will die with you." He gritted his teeth and shouted in the direction of Brando. Unfortunately, Brando seemed to have really disappeared, and there was no response from that direction. "You will regret this." Devard finally panicked. He knew that he was just bluffing, but he didn't expect the other party to be so indifferent. He was covered in cold sweat, and at the last moment he shouted, "Count Tonagel, I know you want me to lead these monsters to Ducarec, but don't even think about it. This time I will never give in to you." Brando was hiding under King Buni's concealment cloak. When he heard Devard's words, he couldn't help but be amused, thinking that this guy's imagination was really rich. He really didn't think about it at all. After all, these revitalizing spells were surging energy bodies. If by any chance, even if there was only a 1 in 10,000 chance that the precious thing in Arek's hand would explode, then it would be really fun. But if Devard was really stubborn and did not move, it would not be good. He had the cloak of the Buni King, so he was not afraid of being dragged to his death. But if these revitalizing spells lost their target and happened to hit Veronica and her party who were still passing through the Eternal Extinction Square, it would be troublesome. He thought about it for a while and finally asked, "What are your conditions?" But he used a little trick. He used a second circle air spell, sound dispersion, so that the other party could not identify the source of the sound. When Devard heard Brando's voice for the first time, he felt that the other party's voice could be so pleasant to the ears. He hurriedly shouted, "Save me! Are you kidding me?" Brando sneered. "If I save you, who will lead these monsters away from me?" He usually saw this guy as a little stupid under Arek, but he was still reliable. He didn't expect his intelligence to plummet at the critical moment. Devard saw that the corridor was silent again, and the revitalizing spells were only a dozen meters away from him. He gritted his teeth, hurriedly ran a few steps forward, and stopped again. He realized that he had said something stupid, but he was not a real fool after all. After a little consideration, he understood Brando's real intention. "I will lead these monsters away, but you have to promise me one thing." "What is it?" "I want you to promise on behalf of Her Royal Highness to spare the Duke's life." Devard took a deep breath and replied, "Why should I promise on behalf of Her Royal Highness?" Brando couldn't help but feel a little amused. He thought to himself that this guy's brain must have been damaged, otherwise, why would he say something stupid again and again? "Because you are the Count of Tonagel, the person who reached out to save her and her brother when the royal faction betrayed her. You signed an agreement with His Royal Highness on the surface to recuperate, but in reality, it is to balance the North and South. In this way, Her Royal Highness, whose relationship with the royal faction is difficult to repair, will inevitably have to rely on you. You sit on Tonagel, Count Radner will also be your fiefdom in the future. When you grow stronger, your position in Erewhon will be unshakable. In the Battle of Ampere-Seal, you are the biggest winner. You are the future Minister of Erewhon, the one who will truly have the final say. How can Her Royal Highness not listen to you?" Devard roared angrily. Brendel was slightly taken aback. He did not expect this girl to come up with so many reasons. Signing an agreement with His Royal Highness was for the sake of balancing the North and the South. He suddenly shook his head with a bitter smile. To outsiders it must be the same. Even Her Royal Highness probably thought so too. It was just that she could not bring it up in front of him. It was only at this moment that he suddenly understood why Princess Griffine's attitude suddenly changed so drastically after the Battle of Ampere-Seal. He once thought it was out of gratitude, but now he thought that he was too naive. It was likely that the princess had already thought it through that night. At that time she clearly had the intention to kill him, but she suddenly restrained herself and made an alliance with him. One had to know that she was a princess from the royal family. This kind of obvious change in attitude, perhaps only a guy like him who had no knowledge of politics and people's hearts would take it for granted. Keeping the eldest son of the king as an enemy was to prevent Her Royal Highness and the royal faction from burning the bridge after crossing the river. Then, together with the Highland Knight and Duke Vero, they would eliminate Count Randner, a loser who stood on the wrong side at the crucial moment. Even Brando himself believed that Randner would definitely be his territory in the future. Otherwise, why would Her Royal Highness give him the title of Count when Tanajul was not even a Count's territory? When he became Count Randner, in the eyes of outsiders, whether he admitted it or not, he would be Erwin's minister in the future. Brando could almost imagine his future path. Marrying Her Royal Highness and becoming Erwin's regent. What Erek did not do today, in his opinion, was already within reach. What was even more dangerous was that a change of dynasty was not impossible, as long as something happened to the little prince. Brando suddenly broke out in a cold sweat. If even he could think of it, what would Her Royal Highness think? She would absolutely not tolerate any threat to her brother. He suddenly realized that Princess Grafine made Haruz his student and accompanied him on this trip. This was a deliberate arrangement in itself. Because he could not be considered to be fully fledged, it was impossible for him to make a move against Haruz at this time, and to let him take the title of Haruz's teacher was also to make him hesitate. Erwin and Cruz place great importance on righteousness and honor, and the change of dynasty was often based on those illusory promises and legends. Just like the decline of House Cipher, it was only because they had lost the favor of the Lionheart sword. And House Yenbao could use the shattering of the sword throne as a reason to ask Her Royal Highness Princess Grafine and her brother to abdicate. Duke Erek had been in business for several generations, and in terms of strength, it could be said that he had long surpassed the royal family, but he still dared not act rashly and covet the throne. He also needed a reasonable reason to intervene in the change of the king, for example a political marriage. The same was true for the nobles in the north. No matter how powerful they were, they still had to rely on House Cipher, which had fallen 1,000 years ago, because this was the tradition and the rule that everyone had to follow. And Erwin would absolutely not tolerate a kingslayer, master killer, or a person who plotted to kill his own student to ascend the throne, because these were even more dishonorable. Her Royal Highness really put a lot of thought into this. Brando could not help but sigh. He was almost certain that this was a test, and Maynard, who was by his side, was the princess's spy. But if Her Royal Highness knew the true origin of Maynard, he was afraid that she would immediately consider switching people. These were the so-called inevitable coincidences of history. But Brando shook his head. He had no interest in these things. Whether it was Erwin's throne or the fate and future of this country, if it was not because of the experience in the other world, it had nothing to do with him at all. Presumably Senior was the same. Most of the time a person tended to be rational, but his life was often dominated by his emotions. Whether it was Erek, Devard, Her Royal Highness, or even Amandina and the others around him, they would never understand what he really pursued. Perhaps only one person could understand, just like how she once innocently asked, "Brando, what do you want to do?" "I want to be a merchant in the future." He replied that he wanted to save Erwin, and wanted to drag the kingdom back from its set track of destruction. Everyone could think that this was just an excuse, and their lord must have a more ambitious goal. But it was actually that simple. "You want to be a merchant, I want to be a savior." It was as simple as a child saying that he wanted to be a general in the future or a king. Because he wanted it, so he did it, there was no other reason. Brando chuckled and shook his head. When he took Devard's words as a joke, the latter was in torment. Although it was just a moment, the army of revitalizing spell was already close at hand. Devard simply didn't know what he said wrong. Why did that damn schemer, devil, and swindler suddenly stop talking? Even if he wanted him to live or die, at least give him a definite answer. The current situation really made him unable to advance or retreat. If it wasn't for the fact that he had a request, Devard would have cursed at him immediately. But Brando finally woke up, he shook his head and said, "This request is impossible." Although it was a refusal, Devard let out a long sigh. "You are too harsh, Count." "Devard, whether Duke Erek lives or dies, it's not up to you or me to decide. What's more, he hasn't failed yet. You are here to arrange for your master's funeral. I'm afraid it's not very good. Brando sneered. Originally he wouldn't have failed, but after you appeared here, it's not so easy to say. Devard hated in his heart. Erek still didn't know that Brando and Veronica had chased him to this place. This in itself showed that the development of things had exceeded their expectations. Perhaps the Duke still had a backup plan. But the young man in front of him was not so easy to deal with. In fact, he had a strange premonition in his heart. They might have failed long ago, and Brando appeared here just to salvage something. Devard didn't know that his guess was close to the truth, but Brando's words still made him unable to speak. After all, it was true. He couldn't curse his master to fail, right? He pondered for a moment and finally replied, I only have one request. When he said this, Devard had already rushed forward and distanced himself from the revitalizing spell behind him. Say it. Brando replied. The giant obsidian door was humming in a low voice. Ko Hua retracted her hand from the door. Streams of light flowed in the texture of the door, and all the streams of light gathered in the central groove, forming a bright nebula. It's done. Ekis' eldest daughter replied coldly. Behind her, the eyes of the members of All for One flashed with excitement. Only Erek's expression remained unchanged. His face was gloomy, as if the whole plan had come to an end, but it had nothing to do with him. I have opened this door for you as promised, but you don't seem happy, human? Ko Hua was keenly aware of this, and she asked absent-mindedly. Humans and civilization are one step closer to their destruction. What's there to be happy about? Erek replied faintly. Huh. Ekis' eldest daughter showed interest for the first time. Her lips under the shadow of the hood also floated a curious arc. I thought that was your life's goal. Now that your wish has been achieved, shouldn't you be satisfied and excited? That is indeed my life's goal. Erek was silent for a while before replying in a hoarse voice. But if there is a final outcome that is inevitable, then it will seem ordinary. Civilization is drifting away on the path of stupidity. Their destruction is just a path they brought upon themselves. But in any case, I am still one of them. Their destruction is our destruction. What's there to celebrate? Then why are you still doing it? Ko Hua felt more and more confused about these strange humans. They were not the Golden Race. The Golden Race was the servant of the divine people, and the staunchest defender of order. They were not the Silver People. The Silver People were the followers of the law. From the wilderness of the Four Territories to the shallow sea, from the border of the Black Forest to the most distant elemental frontier, they monitored and witnessed the changes of order. They had never heard of a traitor among the Golden Race or the Silver People. But these people in front of her were the last generation of the Black Iron People. It was Ko Hua's first time dealing with these humans, but she felt a strange feeling from them. She seemed to have realized something, but immediately shook her head and threw this strange premonition to the back of her mind. After a roar, the giant obsidian door gradually retreated to both sides, revealing a dark corridor behind. The soft light from the magic gemstones held high in the hands of the members of All for One poured in through the open gap, illuminating the corridor that had been covered in dust for thousands, or even tens of thousands of years. Spiral Hall. There were even people who let out a low cry. Miss Ko Hua, you are not human and can't understand human emotions. Most of the time, humans claim to be rational, but their lives are often driven by emotions, making them do things that are very impulsive and incomprehensible in the eyes of others. Erek did not seem to care about what was happening in front of him. He showed a rare interest and chatted with the noble lady. Are you the same? Ko Hua narrowed her eyes and stared at the old man who seemed to have completely withered on the surface, but she could feel the will supported by a strong majesty in the other's stooped body. Although this majesty seemed a little ridiculous to her, for others it was inviolable. I am also human, I am not excluded. Erek replied. Let order return to truth. Don't you agree that this is a great purpose? Ko Hua asked again. This is indeed a great purpose, far beyond those flies about power and interests. I have seen too much stupidity, so I finally chose this path. In order to ensure that I am correct, I have even read a lot of literature and information. Few people know that I have studied for a long time in the White Tower of the Bugas. I participated in the last Holy War, but everything I have seen is confirming my guess. The Flame King established crews for only 1,000 years. Do his descendants remember the glory of 1,000 years ago? The Wind Elves betrayed their sages almost immediately. The Sun, Moon, and Star Elves, where are the Moon Elves and where are the Star Elves? Today's fanzine is vulgar, and has long lost the transcendence of the past. Civilization and order is nothing more than a simple repetition of mistakes for 1,000 years. I am tired of this cycle of sameness. Instead of letting the future generations repeat the tragedies of their predecessors, it is better to end it once and for all. Ko Hua raised her thin eyebrows slightly, probably not expecting to elicit a long speech from the old man. But she immediately asked with her usual sharpness, I hear you speak with a strong sense of righteousness, but it is not difficult to hear the resentment in your words, human. I've never acted in the name of righteousness. I just want to make sure that what I do is right. You're right. My personal anger is my motivation. But that's my own secret. There's no need to tell outsiders. He shook his head, as if he didn't want to continue on this topic. The team moved slowly along the dark passage. After passing through a long and narrow arched door, an open space suddenly appeared in front of them. It was a spherical hall. There were similar arched doors in all directions of the hall. Each path extended from the arched door, forming a long bridge that spiraled to the center of the hall. There was a huge platform there. But the platform was not empty. But there was a stone throne, and a purple crystal was floating on the throne. When the members of All for One entered the hall, they saw a tall blue figure sitting on the throne, standing up to greet them. Humans, this is not the place where you should be. If you retreat now, you will still have room for regret. When the blue figure spoke, the whole hall buzzed. The witches once said that there was magic in language, but at this moment, the members of All for One finally understood the truth of the legend. The other party's words were not loud, but when the voice came, it was like a stormy sea. Every word seemed to be intertwined with lightning and thunder. It was obviously just a short warning, but everyone, including Erek, felt as if they had fallen into an endless storm. They were trudging through the biting cold wind, and in front of them seemed to be looming the peak of the mountain where the storm stopped. In all directions there were endless glaciers, and in the blink of an eye, they would be completely buried under this 10,000-year-old ice. In just a short sentence, everyone understood the identity of the tall figure in front of them. Milos, the god of frost giants. Even Ko Hua bowed and greeted with a clear voice, Lord Melandal, long time no see. The voice sighed, Little Ko Hua, I thought you had stayed away from the war. It seems that things still don't go as you wish. As soon as the voice fell, the illusion in front of Erek and others finally disappeared. P.S. There is one more chapter later. Today's update is almost 11,000 words. Everyone, please give me your strength, support, and monthly votes. Work hard this month and strive for full attendance. Chapter 8:15. Little Ko Hua, I thought you had distanced yourself from the war. It seems that things still don't go as you wish. The voice sighed. I can't help it, Lord Melandal. The blue figure nodded and stopped talking to Ko Hua. Instead, he turned to Erek and the others and said, I know why you are here, but you may not know the truth behind what you are doing. You are the Black Iron people, and according to my agreement with the crystal, I will not make things difficult for you. The awakening god is under this throne. You can choose the future of this world for yourself. After that, he took one last look at Ko Hua, and his figure gradually faded and disappeared. Only Erek and the others were left in the hall. I didn't expect that agreement to be true, Erek said in a low voice. The crystal dragon made an agreement with the gods that the generation of Black Iron could decide their own destiny. The gods stayed away from Woned and no longer interfered with everything on this land. The so-called Azure Night breaking the sky was just an opportunity at the beginning of this history. I'm very curious about what happened before and after the Battle of Ebabel. He looked at Ko Hua, but the eldest daughter of Ekis kept her mouth shut this time and did not answer. That must be a big secret, Erek thought. But this secret was destined to be buried under the dust, because once Milos woke up, that dark soul would take advantage of the situation and enter. The giant god Milos would no longer be the guardian of order, but a true dark giant. Under its power, Erwin would usher in true dusk. At that time, the so-called secret would be worthless, because the dead did not need secrets. He looked at the others and said, Let's do it. Open the portal to the Sulphur River near the throne. The eyes of the members of All for One flashed with excitement as they walked along the spiral bridge to the central platform. Arek watched this scene quietly, then turned to Ko Hua and said, "Once that soul obtains Milo's body, according to the agreement, you will be free. This is also the agreement between you and Lord Ekis. We have no intention of offending you." Ko Hua nodded, as if he didn't mind such a small offense. She looked in a certain direction in the hall and replied softly, "It seems that your guest has arrived, human." Arek was slightly startled, and then he looked up in that direction. A moment later, a group of people appeared in that direction. It was Veronica and her group. And at the same time that Arek discovered the other party, Veronica apparently also discovered the existence of All for One. "Arek." It was Veronica's voice. "I didn't expect you to fall so low. You're a descendant of the nobles, but now you're standing side by side with the enemy of civilization. Your actions have shamed your ancestors. From this moment onwards, the banner of the Sprinting Wolf clan will no longer flutter. A clan will fall apart because of his unfilial descendants. And that is what you are doing right now." Arek raised his eyebrows. He didn't expect Veronica to arrive so quickly. But he didn't panic at all. Instead, he replied disdainfully, "Cliché Veronica. Being in a high position has made you used to these high-sounding rhetoric. But they mean nothing to me. Family and glory, you can go and say that to those refugees struggling in hunger and cold. The so-called glory is not as meaningful as a copper coin to them. It's the same for me because I don't care about such things at all. Mortals are always burdened by false reputation, so they repeatedly make those low-level mistakes. Veronica, tell me, what are family and glory?" He snorted coldly, ignoring Veronica's words. "Simply unreasonable," Veronica muttered. "This guy is simply crazy." Brando listened to the conversation between the two from behind, and couldn't help but smile bitterly. This was probably because of their different identities and perspectives. Although Arek was also a noble, he was obviously more interested in the identity of a cultist. For these lunatics in the eyes of ordinary people, family and glory were indeed meaningless. In fact, even in his opinion, he had to admit that Arek's words made sense. Indeed, in many cases the so-called glory was actually worthless. Nobles like to use the sense of glory as the standard of all things in the world, but in Brando's opinion, this was at best a noble standard. But he just thought about it and didn't dare to say it out loud. He understood that he had such an idea because half of the soul in his body came from another era, and in the current wound, Veronica's previous words were still relatively mainstream. Brando didn't want to be a non-mainstream, and didn't want to be taught a lesson by this army commander in private, so he wisely chose not to be entangled with him on this issue. But this didn't mean that he agreed with Arek's view. Arek, the Black Iron generation can control their own destiny, but it doesn't mean that you can control the destiny of others. Whether this world is right or wrong, it's not up to you, and it's not up to All for One to say. After Brando agreed to Devard's request, he returned to Veronica and the others wearing the Buny King's cloak. After passing through the Perpetual Extinction Square, they actually directly entered the Spiral Hall, but they were delayed a little while trying to find a way to open the door outside, so they entered the hall one step later than Arek. But even so, they still heard the last words of Arek and Milos. Arek looked at Brando with slight surprise. "It seems that you know my purpose very well, young man, but I never said whether what I think is right or not needs to be recognized by others. If you want to stop me, I'm afraid it's not that simple." Brando had already seen the members of All for One who were drawing the magic circle in the center of the hall at a glance. He narrowed his eyes. The whole hall was exactly the same as he had seen in the game, except for the columnar crystal suspended above the throne. He carefully thought about it and confirmed that he had not seen anything similar. It seemed that this was indeed the first time the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator was opened, and it was slightly different from the later generations. "That crystal is a little strange, but there's nothing wrong with it. Our primary goal is not the magic circle in the center, but the star-shaped stone in Arek's hand," he immediately reminded. Veronica nodded. Since the battle was inevitable, she did not hesitate and directly ordered, "Everyone, concentrate on attacking the magic circle in the center of the hall." Brando was slightly startled, and he couldn't help but look back at the female Legion commander, but although the other party verbally gave such an order, her eyes never left Arek. He thought for a moment and understood the thoughts of the female Legion commander. Sure enough, Veronica immediately turned back and whispered to him, "Later, Mephistopheles and I will distract him. You and Miss Alaz will go and get the star-shaped stone." Brando nodded. He had to admit that the Legion commander of the Cruise people was indeed worthy of her reputation. Veronica gave the order, and the atmosphere in the hall suddenly became tense. In fact, the military officers of the Cruise people had begun to spread out on both sides of the hall, standing on the bridge and shooting at the central platform with magic bows. Although these aristocratic knights were usually pampered, most of them were at least in the gold realm, and under the preemptive strike, 2 of the believers of All for One fell to the ground immediately. One of them was shot in the face, and his whole head almost exploded like a smashed watermelon, while the other was pierced through the arm, but compared to the other, it was only a minor injury. Only then did the cultists react, and propped up a magic shield on the platform, blocking the follow-up attacks. As soon as Brando saw the shield, he immediately understood that there was an elemental awakened wizard on the platform. The Wall of Truth was at least an 8th circle spell. The effect of the spell was to forcibly separate the inside and outside of the wall into 2 different worlds, completely immune to all physical attacks. Even the Shire could not cast this spell. The witches who came here with him tried to cast a spell to dispel the spell, and without exception, all of them failed. Since Brando could recognize it, it was naturally not difficult for Veronica and Mephistopheles. In their opinion, Erek was indeed well prepared. In a battle involving an elemental awakened, the combat power of those below the gold peak was almost meaningless. Of course, Brando was an exception. Before the elemental awakening, he had fought with elemental awakened enemies more than once. Of course, that was also thanks to the Planeswalker system. Veronica and Mephistopheles drew their swords at the same time, and floated up at the same time. The green and gray lines of law reflected each other. At this time, Brando found that the 2 were very compatible. One was a gray sword saint, the other a green sword saint. There was no grudge at all when they worked together, as if they had been partners for many years. Sometimes old rivals could also be the best partners because they knew each other too well. In his previous life, some people were keen on gossip about Veronica and Mephistopheles. Brando used to scoff at it, but today he had to believe the truth that the existence of any hot topic in the Amber Sword was inevitable. As soon as Veronica and Mephistopheles joined the battle, the believers of All for One in the center of the platform suddenly became in danger. What a joke! In Brando's view, the elemental awakened wizard hidden in the crowd was at most at the level of elemental awakening, and Veronica herself was at the peak of the law. Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles was even more amazing. He could almost be said to be the first existence to step into the extreme planes in the last 50 years of the Cruise Empire. The previous one was Her Majesty the Empress of Cruise, but that was also because of a special opportunity, and before that there were only the real old monsters left. Because when Veronica attacked, the wizard could still barely hold on, but when Mephistopheles attacked, the magic shield suddenly fell apart, and all the believers on the platform were slapped out of thin air, and one after another they staggered. Seeing the battle like this, Erek couldn't help but say, "Mephistopheles." He almost squeezed the name out from between his teeth. Although he had heard that Mephistopheles was hanging out with the young man, he didn't expect him to really pull down his face to help Cruz, which was somewhat beyond his expectations. But fortunately, he was not unprepared. He saw Erek point forward with his cane, and 5 of the black-robed knight behind him rose into the air. Flying without the help of spells was the most obvious sign of elemental awakening, but Erek actually had close to double digits of elemental awakening by his side, which made Brando wonder if the other party's position in All for One was too high, or the strength of All for One was too strong. However, those elemental awakened existences were only at the level of elemental awakening, and together they could barely suppress Veronica, but it was still impossible to challenge the current Ash Sword Saint. Erek obviously understood this, and he had to take a step back and look at Ko Hua beside him. "Miss Ko Hua, I can only ask for your help." Ko Hua didn't say a word, but just nodded indifferently. But when she turned her head, there was a flash of light in the depths of her eyes that even Erek couldn't detect. Brando saw another person fly up from the group of All for One in less than a moment, and was sighing in his heart that Erek had a lot of talents under him. But suddenly he realized that something was wrong. Looking up and taking a closer look, The conspicuous white hair and red eyes of Ekis' eldest daughter were simply too eye-catching. Brando felt that something was wrong. Wasn't this the slightly dim Ko Hua? He was simply too familiar with her. The ice beauty of the holy cathedral of the hibernator. Which player wouldn't know her? Not to mention that she was under the control of Dark Soul. I didn't expect Rek to actually wake her up. Brando knew Ko Hua's strength. Although it was far inferior to his cheap teacher, Ko Hua was an ancient twilight species and Ekis' daughter. It could be said that her bloodline was pure, and not something that the two losers Main and Mare could compare to. And as a boss, she had many special skills. If she was caught off guard, Veronica and Mephisto might really suffer a big loss. Thinking of this, he hurriedly reminded, "Be careful, teacher, Sir Legion Commander, that's Ko Hua." As soon as Brando spoke, he attracted Ko Hua's attention. Not many people knew her now except for Rek, and that was because the other party had seen her original body. But she didn't expect that someone on the enemy's side would recognize her in her human form at a glance. Although she was flying in the direction of Mephisto, she actually had other plans in mind. Now that her identity was called out, she was very angry. The eldest daughter of Ekis hated in her heart, and immediately looked in the direction of Brando. But what she didn't expect was that Brando seemed to know her character very well. He pulled the little female dragon over first, then lifted the concealing cloak and covered the two of them tightly. Concealing cloak? Ko Hua saw Brando's last move, and then the two of them completely disappeared. Ordinary invisibility spells couldn't escape her perception, but now she seemed to have completely lost Brando's breath. She was experienced and knowledgeable, so naturally she guessed what the other party had used. But unfortunately, guessing was just guessing. It didn't mean that she had a way to break it. Buni was a god in her time who was on the same level as Milos, and was on the same level as her mother. The effect of his cloak was not something she could see through. The girl secretly gritted her teeth and secretly remembered Brando's appearance in her heart. Then she turned around and continued to fly towards Mephisto. Seeing that she turned and left, Brando, who was hiding under the cloak, was really relieved. What a joke, being targeted by a demigod-like existence was not a fun thing. Of course, Brando didn't know that he had been targeted, and thought that he had escaped. While he was relieved, he noticed that Alaz next to him had a look of disdain on her face. "You dare to do it, but you don't dare to admit it," the little female dragon commented incisively. That was a little arrogant. Brando stared at the little female dragon. "It seems that you still owe me a promise. Believe it or not, I want you to turn into a dragon and fly me over. Anyway, I'm going to trouble a wreck." "You dare?" The little female dragon was shocked. Although there were often legends of the Dragon Knight in history, in fact, no dragon was really willing to be someone else's mount. Just like the Dragon Queen Angelica, her mount was just a pure-blooded flying dragon. If Brando really made her his mount, then she would have no face to return to the Dragon Clan in the future. Well, even if she had the face to return, the elders would skin her alive. Wouldn't that be a shame to the Dragon Clan? Of course, although she was threatening on the surface, in fact, she was still a little scared in her heart. The Dragon Clan valued oaths. In their view, the contracts made under the stars were carried out under the witness of Bahamut, so they generally wouldn't make an oath easily. But once the oath was made, even a lazy guy like Sheeta would have to stay in this desolate place for hundreds of years. Previously, she thought that Brando would lose, so in a moment of excitement, she pulled Sheeta and made a bet with Brando. Now Sheeta only needed to hand over the useless heart of the dragon. Of course, in Allah's view it was useless, but she was unlucky. She didn't know what strange request Brando would make. "Why wouldn't I dare? It's just whether I want to or not. So you have to be more respectful to me, understand?" Brando was simply too happy. During this period of time, he was tormented by this little female dragon. Now that he finally got his revenge, the feeling was simply too good to describe. "Is this a request?" the little female dragon whispered. "Of course not. Then why should I respect you? You can be disrespectful, but I can't guarantee that I won't remember making you my mount." Brando replied matter-of-factly. "You." Allah's eyes were red. "You're despicable and shameless." "Same to you," Brando replied. "Well, I won't talk nonsense with you. Now come with me to ambush a wreck. If you get that star-shaped stone later, Maybe you can use it to exchange for a request with me. He knew that if he blindly relied on threats, he was afraid that this little female dragon with a temper would not be so willing. But if he guided her patiently and systematically, she would definitely be fooled. Sure enough, the little female dragon's eyes lit up because she found that Brando's words were quite reasonable. If she snatched the star-shaped stone first, she could use it to threaten Brando. If he dared to not withdraw the bet, she would detonate the star-shaped stone. Anyway, the worst-case scenario was that they would all die together. Thinking of this, the little female dragon's eyes were filled with little stars for a moment. She felt that she was simply too witty. Both of them had their own ulterior motives, but they could be considered to have reached an agreement. Beauty's cloak had been used twice that day, and there was not much time left for it to last. So they immediately moved, and with the cloak, they carefully flew in the direction of Erek while sticking close to the wall of the hall. At this time, the battle in the hall had just reached its climax. P.S. Second update, looking for monthly vote. Chapter 8:16. At the beginning of the battle, the black-robed knight beside Erek had spread out and occupied the two long bridges on the left and right. Therefore, if Brando wanted to sneak up on him, he would have to cross one of the lines of defense. Fortunately, this was no trouble for Brando, who had the concealing cloak. He directly flew over the crowd with the cloak. This kind of sneaky action was exciting for the little female dragon. She asked with great interest, "I didn't know this stupid cloak was so fun before. Otherwise I would have asked William for it. Brando, can you lend it to me for 2 days?" Not good. Brando always politely declined this kind of business that could not be returned from. Stingy. Her reasonable request was rejected. Of course, in Allah's view, it was very reasonable. She immediately showed her ferocious side, showing her little white fangs. She glanced at Brando and found that he was still holding her wrist. The little female dragon did not think and directly bit him hard. Hiss! Brando gasped in pain. Even if his skin was as hard as steel, those were dragon teeth. And why was this guy like a dog? Wasn't she a dragon? He turned around in annoyance, but did not expect Alaz to lie on his back and bite his neck. Brando's veins were popping out. He backhanded Alaz's wrist and pulled her over. Just as he was about to scold her, he found that Alaz was staring at him with her golden eyes. Her little mouth was pursed, and she looked like she was about to cry. Brando was stunned, and then suddenly felt a headache. Only then did he remember that although Alaz was usually like a little demon, she was still just a little girl. According to the age of dragons, she was at most equivalent to a human girl of 12 or 13 years old. Brando was suddenly sweating. He just grabbed her arm a little too hard in a moment of excitement. He did not expect to make the little girl cry. After all, this was a battlefield. He hurriedly stared at the little female dragon and thought to himself, "Please don't cry. Although the Beauty King's cloak can cover it, it's not awesome enough to watch a movie in it. You're hurting me." Alaz retracted her arm and said softly. Even in his deepest nightmares, Brando had never imagined this side of the little female dragon. He thought for a moment and realized that he did not seem to have the talent to coax girls. If it was someone like Freya, he could still reason with her. But in the face of an unreasonable little girl like Alaz, he was helpless. He was stunned for almost a second before he said, "I'm sorry. No one has ever been so mean to me since I was young." Alaz looked at him with red eyes. Damn, Brando finally understood. She was definitely acting coquettishly. This was the little girl's trump card. But what could he do? They had already crossed the last long bridge and were less than 20 meters away from Erek. Erek was surrounded by a row of black-robed night guards on both sides. Normally, he should be thinking about how to catch the old guy off guard instead of coaxing the little girl here. This was really the most dangerous situation in history, Brando thought. He could bet that if he did not settle Alaz, the little female dragon would definitely make a scene later. Forget about attacking Erek later. It would be amazing if she did not become immortal. Brando looked at Alaz. Of course, he knew what the little female dragon wanted. He just had to look at where her red eyes were looking. Anyway, it was nothing more than the Beauty King's cloak in his hand. Brando gritted his teeth but still said softly, "Okay, don't cry. I'll lend you the cloak later, okay?" "What do you mean, okay?" Alaz's face was still wet, but she wrinkled her nose in disdain. You don't even know how to coax a girl. Can't you be gentler? So perfunctory. Let's do it again. He looked at Arek's direction and almost lost his temper. You better be content with what you have, or I'll have to die with you. Arek's words were like thunder to Brendel's ears. You better know your limits or I'll have to die with you. Alaz snorted softly with her little nose. She fiddled with her blonde curls. Her long eyelashes were half closed and she glanced at him with the light golden eyes below. Meaning, I'm not afraid of you dying with me. She continued to nitpick. Humph, so rude, not gentlemanly at all. I don't know what Amandina likes about you. Don't think that no one knows what you did in Arek. You only know how to bully women. Brando's eyes widened. What did I do? For example, forcibly kissing that human princess. And? Stop. Brando hurriedly begged for mercy. He finally understood that this little female dragon's voyeurism was not a matter of a day or two. He thought that she had only arrived at the last moment of the battle in Ampere-Seal, but it turned out that she had been hiding around for a long time. But the little female dragon's words finally hit his soft spot this time. The last thing Brando wanted to talk about now was the impulse of that night. Even now, sometimes the princess looked at him with a gloomy look. One could imagine how impactful his actions were at that time. In fact, now that he thought about it, sometimes he wanted to find a hole to hide in. He hurriedly begged for mercy. Stop, I was wrong, I'm sorry, okay? Hee, it seems that you care a lot about this matter. Alaz finally smiled through her tears. She promised, don't worry, as long as you lend me the cloak, I'll return it to you in 2 days. And later, I'll help you beat up that Arek. She also stood on tiptoe and patted Brando's shoulder symbolically. Brando directly ignored the first half of the little female dragon's sentence. The last time she borrowed Scarlet's azure lance to play, the Bugas sent out William, Logar and Ajani, the 3 wizard leaders, as well as Tulman, the former wizard leader, to get the azure lance back. In between, countless humiliating treaties mixed with blood and tears were signed. Lending something to a dragon, this was something that only a naive girl like Scarlet would think of, and because of this she was blamed by the Bugas for a long time. But as for beating up Arek, Brando thought to himself that Arek had nothing to do with him. The Battle of Ampere-Seal was already considered the end of their feud, and now at best, it was just beating a dog in the water. The real victim this time was actually Cruz's people, and he was just doing his job. Since the victim did not ask for it, why did he have to be the bad guy and beat up Arek? Brando could only say that he could not understand the little female dragon's thinking logic. But the little female dragon's next sentence immediately messed him up. I know you like that mixed blood princess, right? That damn old man dared to steal your bride. Even I can't stand it, so beating him up is only right. Alaz licked her lips, her sharp little tongue licking her lips until they glistened. Her eyes were also shining, and the violent elements in them were obvious. Brendel almost spat out a mouthful of blood. What the hell is this? He hurriedly stopped the little female dragon from continuing, otherwise, who knew what she would bring up? Besides, they had been delayed long enough, and any further delay would affect the situation. In fact, he had already seen Veronica looking around in midair in the hall. Needless to say, she was obviously looking for him and Alaz, and wanted to see why they had not appeared yet. Brando raised a finger and motioned for Alaz to keep quiet. At this time, the 2 of them had already flown over Arek's head. The black-robed knight around the Duke was very tight, and he looked left and right, and it seemed that he could only attack from behind. But behind Arek stood a figure in a black robe, neither dressed like a knight, nor like a cultist priest. Brando was a little unsure of the person's depth for a while, but Arek dared to let this person protect his back. Obviously he trusted his ability very much, and thought that he at least had the strength of elemental activation. Can you see through that guy's depth? Brando looked for a long time and had no clue, but the Beauty King's cloak only lasted for the last 10 seconds, and he had to turn back to seek the little female dragon's ability. Weird. I smell our scent on that guy, Alaz said, and sniffed deliberately, then frowned. Us? You mean that's a dragon? Brando was startled, and was glad that he had not acted rashly. What? I didn't say that. The little female dragon rolled her eyes at him. I said that he has our scent on him, but I'm not familiar with this smell, at least I haven't smelled it before. As long as it's a dragon that lives in Wonde, There's no dragon that I don't know. If he really is a dragon, then he must be from other continents. She thought for a moment, then wrinkled her nose and added with some disdain. Of course, in fact, it's not only dragons that have the blood of the dragon race flowing in them, we also have some inferior distant relatives, and may also be those things. In short, you need to confirm it yourself. You might as well not say it. Brando saw Alaz showing her sharp teeth again and hurriedly stopped her. Don't you want to bite for a while? I want you to bite as much as you want, but not now. Later I'll deal with the wreck, you help me deal with the strange guy behind. No, what if it's a dragon? I don't want to fight my own people. Alaz shook her head like a rattle drum. Well then you go deal with the wreck and I'll help you deal with that strange guy. Brando thought for a moment, and felt that this was more feasible. Although the little female dragon was not very reliable, she was still much stronger than him, and after all she was still a dragon. But no matter how he looked at Alaz, she looked like she had succeeded in her conspiracy, and he did not know what this girl was scheming about. The last 3 seconds of the cloak's duration. Brando did not dare to stay any longer, and immediately pulled the little female dragon to land between Erek and the strange man in the black robe. At this time the power of King Buni's cloak was demonstrated. Under normal circumstances, no invisibility spell could completely conceal a person's breath. A low-level invisibility spell could conceal visible light, but could not conceal sound and smell. A slightly more advanced invisibility spell could conceal smell, but the invisibility spell needed to reach the 10th circle of the aura of atmosphere. But no matter what kind of invisibility spell it was impossible to make you invisible face-to-face in front of an elemental-activated opponent, because once you entered the field of elemental activation, the lines of law would naturally surround your body, and in any case your existence itself would affect the laws which could not be concealed. But Brando held up the concealing cloak, and was only 3 feet away from the strange man in the black robe in front of him, and almost the same distance from Erek behind him, so the two of them did not notice at all. Brando made a gesture, and he and the little female dragon immediately stood back to back. The cloak was almost at the last second, and Brando also glanced at the appearance of the strange man in the black robe in front of him. Unfortunately, the other party's face was completely hidden under the hood, and it was impossible to see clearly. He only saw a pair of shining golden eyes, which were very similar to Alaz. Was it really a dragon? He could not help but feel his heart skip a beat. And at this time, Alaz had already made her move on Erek. Erek held the cane in one hand and the heart of the dragon in the other, completely unaware of the enemy who had sneaked up behind him. The little female dragon directly lifted the cloak, and even without any fancy movements, she stretched out her claws and dragged Erek back, and then her right hand took advantage of the momentum to snatch the star-shaped stone from Erek's hand. Erek was stunned for a moment before he realized that his hand was empty, and the heart of the dragon had been in the hands of someone else. He stared dumbfounded at the little girl who suddenly appeared in front of him without warning, and asked in a wrong voice, "Who are you?" Then he saw Alaz's pair of very distinctive golden eyes clearly, and he lost his voice. Dragon Clan. But Alaz did not have the leisure to pay attention to him, and directly rushed up to punch him in the face. The physical fitness of the Dragon Clan was so strong that Brando also later found out that the little female dragon herself was actually only in the strength of elemental activation, but the power she exerted was already close to the peak of the Law Veronica's strength, and even surpassed it. The Dragon Clan was a natural golden race, and after passing the elemental activation stage, they would directly become golden bodies, and this potential was fully displayed at this moment in battle. Poor Duke Erek. Although his strength had also improved greatly after the Battle of Ampere Seal. But unfortunately this improvement was based on his spellcasting ability. His close combat ability could be said to be still at the level of the former Grand Duke who led the army in the past, and against ordinary soldiers it could be said that he could fight against 10 ordinary soldiers, but in front of Alaz, he was as clumsy and ridiculous as a child. The instinct of decades of military life made him subconsciously pull out his sword, to block Alaz's straight punch, of course, at the moment he was holding the staff that had always been with him. This block would have seemed wonderful to a human at this stage, but unfortunately the little female dragon did not listen to reason, and directly punched his staff, and the staff was torn apart in the air, and then the fist continued to move forward, and smashed into his old face without reservation. Erek suddenly screamed, and fell on his back with a nosebleed. Brando, I've avenged you. Alaz screamed very happily, as if she was sincerely happy to be able to avenge Brando. But unfortunately, at this moment Brando was not happy at all. Because at the moment when Alaz lifted the cloak, before he had time to make a move, the cloaked monster in front of him had already reacted, and saw a flash of snow under its robe. With decades of combat instincts, Brando knew that it was a long sword. It was indeed a swordsman. He had expected a little before, because the person's posture looked like a swordsman. But there was also something he did not expect, and that was the speed of the other party's reaction. How could it be so fast? Brando knew at a glance that it was not good. He was unprepared. But his reaction was actually a little slower than the other party's. What kind of concept was this? This was not elemental activation at all. The law moved, and there was no need for reaction time at all. This was the damned pinnacle of the law. Another Veronica, and he had bumped into her. He saw the cloaked monster with a long sword in one hand, and the other hand lifted the cloak, revealing a lizard head full of bright patterns. F***CK. Brando reacted immediately. It's him. There were many lizardmen in Wound, and the lizardmen were even divided into many groups. Some lizardmen lived in the forest, but most of them were residents of the swamp, but there were also some mutants, such as desert lizards and sea lizards. Desert lizards were marked by their red skin, while sea lizards' typical characteristics were their bright patterns that symbolized poison, and the long fins on their arms and thighs. But there were thousands of sea lizardmen in Wound, and there was only one sword saint, and that was the sword saint of the Red Ring lizardmen. Noon. When Brando saw this guy, he understood why this guy was here. The Red Ring lizardmen were the most famous of the sea lizardmen, and they were once the servants of the deep-scale Nagas, and later became their subjects. Of course, this was not a problem. The key problem was that the deep-scale Nagas happened to be one of the Frost Dew Queen's archenemies. Obviously, these damned lizardmen had heard of the Grey Fin Naga's actions in Ampere Seal, and it was not difficult to infer that they had formed an alliance with the humans, and now these lizardmen had obviously found another ally on land, which happened to be Brando's archenemy. It was really a case of enemies meeting on a narrow path. Noon stabbed his sword, and the situation was immediately reversed. Brando did not expect to face a sword saint. In the entire Wound, there were only 17 or 18 sword saints in this era, and they were scattered in the various empires. How could they all gather in Erewhon? And Erewhon was not a place with good feng shui. But when Brando did not expect it, this sword saint who was least likely to appear stood in front of him. This was not like Williams, who was half-baked. Noon itself had the strength of the Law of Pinnacle, and its history of becoming a sword saint was much longer than Veronica's. When this sword stabbed over, Brando became the unsuspecting party. He saw the shining sword tip, and countless thoughts flashed through his mind, but none of them told him how to dodge. 9 luminaries, sword saint? Stop joking, it was not that fast. Activating the 9 luminaries sword art required time, and the tip of the enemy's sword was already pointed at his nose. He only had the time to think, either live or die. Even Unyielding couldn't save him. Brendel didn't dare to hope that Unyielding's talent wouldn't treat the head as a vital part. But the moment Brando's blood froze, the floor of the hall suddenly shook, and there was a creaking sound as it tilted downwards. Even the lizardman sword saint did not expect this sudden change, and he could only watch as the sword tip in his hand pierced through Brando's hair. Brando watched the dramatic scene with his mouth agape, and there was only one thought in his mind. Martha bless me, who saved my life. P.S. Today's first update. There will be a second update later. Please vote, everyone. Chapter 8:17. How could I possibly do that? Freya looked into the air in the direction of the voice. She was so shocked that she stood up from the round table. How could I possibly stop a god from waking up? Her mind was in a mess. She didn't know why Milos would choose her. She was just an ordinary person who had nothing to do with the gods. In fact, she thought her ability to accept things was strong enough. Ever since she escaped from Bucci, the series of changes that happened around her had made her dizzy. She finally sorted out a clue and barely adapted to her current identity as a knight. Then suddenly, a god suddenly asked her to help stop its resurrection? What could she do? Pull out the Lionheart sword and stab the god of giants to death? Of course, perhaps in the legends in the future, it would be written that in the last 10 days of the summer in the year of the sword, The female knight Freya assassinated the last god, Milos, the father of the frost giants. After the Azure Knight, she truly ended the era of the gods. Then, these records would gradually be sealed in the scrolls and collected in the lowest layers of the wizard's parchment literature. It would not be mentioned again until thousands of years later. Freya suddenly stopped her delusions and shook her head with a red face. What was this? It was impossible. It was obviously a god. How could he be killed by a mortal like her? Drawing the Lionheart sword, stabbing the giant god to death, and then being recorded in history was a very ridiculous thing. If Brendel was the one writing history, something like this might happen. Anyway, it was just as ridiculous. She patted her face gently and tried to calm herself down, waiting for Milos to speak. Milos seemed to wait for a while before speaking. It's actually very simple. You just have to pull out the Lionheart sword and stab me to death when I wake up. That's all. Freya widened her eyes and half opened her mouth. She even forgot to stop patting her face. It was as if she had been petrified. She was frozen there. Milos suddenly laughed out loud. You have a rich imagination, little girl. But it's just as you think. Of course, it's not that simple. Freya blinked her eyes, her long eyelashes fluttering slightly. She was stunned for a moment before she realized that the giant's father was teasing her. This made her feel a little bitter. What could she say? That was a god. A god joking with a mortal. Was there such a precedent in history? However, even if it was a god, it was still a weird guy with the same personality as Brando, Freya thought to herself. But after a moment, she suddenly reacted and looked over in a panic. You can see what I'm thinking? After all, I'm still a god. Don't worry, little girl. I won't hold a grudge against you for your little offense just now. The voice laughed. That meant that he had actually heard it, but he didn't care about it. Freya's face turned red. She opened her mouth but couldn't say anything. Let's get back to the topic, little girl. Actually, this isn't difficult for you. How can that be? I'm just a mortal. You suddenly want me to stop you from waking up. That's impossible. Freya shook her head. She also felt that she couldn't do it. It's because you're a mortal that I chose you, the voice replied. Freya was slightly stunned. She heard the hidden meaning in this sentence. Confused, she asked, why? Because in this era, only mortals have the right to decide their fate. The voice paused. Have you heard the story of the Azure Knight? You mean the Azure Knight pierced through the sky and caused the stars to fall to the ground, thus bringing about the legend of the mortal era? Freya suddenly felt a little melancholy. She nodded. When I was very young, I heard such a bedtime story. She didn't finish her sentence. At that time, the mountains of Wuxia were still green. Once spring came, the mountains would be filled with flowers. The flames of war seemed to be a distant term. Who would have thought that 10 years later there would be such a day? The owner of the voice seemed to have seen the girl's depressed mood. He gently comforted her. I'm sorry for reminding you of the past, but this story is very important to you and to me. Isn't that a fairy tale? Freya raised her head and asked in a daze. Then do you believe that it has happened before? This was a good question. Freya was stunned for a moment. Did she believe in myths? Regardless of whether it was Erwin or Cruz, there were many myths and legends. The distant ones were like the records in the Pale poem. The recent ones were like the story of King Eric and his knight expanding the territory. There were even folk legends, such as the stories to scare children in the forest and the black prophecies. But should people believe these stories? Some of these stories were fabricated, while some were true. However, after tens or even hundreds of years of spreading, and more or less exaggerated by art, they had long lost their original features. Perhaps the legend of King Eric was still in front of people's eyes, but the story of the Flame King and the other 3 sages was only left with the glorious narratives on the murals. As for the earlier legends about the twilight, they were so distant that they seemed like a dream. There were dreams and nightmares in those dreams, but no one could tell which were real and which were fake. Freya was stunned for a moment before she asked, those are real, right? Some are, but it did happen before. It happened on this land. Freya knew that what Milos was about to say next might be the main point. She quieted down and listened quietly to the father of the frost giants. It was quiet all around. The firewood burned in the fireplace and made a crackling sound. Sometimes she felt that this spacious room might be located in the depths of a mountain. She could even feel the legendary trembling from the depths of the mountains. She didn't know when, but a low buzzing sound echoed around her. The tea had a lingering fragrance. The tea droplets that flew onto the tablecloth had yet to dissipate. The silver knife and fork reflected the warm glow of the candlelight. The faint flame on the white porcelain tea tray flickered, sometimes bright and sometimes dark. It was related to the War of the Twilight Dragon. The gods had a dispute over the future of the world. Martha, our mother, watched us from the hall as always. It was Babel's tower, which later turned into ruins because of the war. But at least in that era, it was still the center of civilization. On the Golden Temple there was a beautiful marble floor like floating clouds. The gods were in the middle. I could only stand at the end of the long line. When the dispute was at its most intense, the whole hall echoed with the voices of Alphonse and Crystal. Was it the Dragon of Fury and the Dragon of Knowledge? Yes. Why should we carry out this plan? Alphonse said so bitterly. He was the most irritable of all his mother's children. Although Tiamat was more resolute, she was much calmer than him. The voice slowly narrated, as if narrating a story that he had seen with his own eyes. Crystal did not reply, but Alphonse continued to mock. The Bronze Generation has been lost. In my opinion, it is more in line with the beauty of order to return to the ancient era. We should not listen to those stupid lies at all, let alone give the decision to those useless people. This is the conspiracy of the Twilight, and it can catch us all in one fell swoop. Shut up, Alphonse. At this time Crystal finally spoke. She was Alphonse's youngest sister. The relationship between the two was once considered stronger than the immortal peak that could never be broken. But at this moment there were faint cracks. They are also Mother's children. Do you want to make Mother sad by saying this? Under his sister's aggressive attack, Alphonse also panicked. I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. However, the wisdom of the crystal was boundless. She continued to speak. Everything that you have said, the arbiters will naturally judge whether it is right or wrong. Our mission is to protect the operation of order, and not to interfere with it. Here you can only choose whether it is right or wrong. She continued to speak. After a moment of silence, Alphonse could only reply, I will never agree. He looked at his sister, and his disappointment was overflowing. The break between the two was like the birth of a new sea. A gap quickly formed and could not be made up. Freya quietly listened to the story. Even if she only listened to Milos's description, she could imagine the fierce dispute in the floating cloud temple. But what she felt was a little inconceivable was why there would be disputes between the gods. Shouldn't they have always been the guardians of the world of order, like generous elders, silently guarding the people of Wonde? Whether it was slander or gratitude from the mortals, the grace always came from the heavens, but there was never any demand. Why? She finally could not help but ask, those useless people, are you talking about us? Milo's voice paused for a moment. Yes, our dispute stems from a choice. A choice? To continue the mistake since the era of the gods, or to give the choice to the mortals, especially in the face of an enemy like the Twilight Dragon. Such a choice, even for the gods, is extremely heavy. But why is there such a choice? Freya asked. Do you know the Bronze Generation? Freya frowned and shook her head. Actually, you have seen them, the voice prompted. The girl was slightly startled, but this time Milos did not let her continue to guess. Instead, he replied directly, the Bronze Generation is rarely mentioned anymore. The Silver Folk and the Gold Folk have destroyed all documents related to it. The few parts that have been preserved are also locked in forbidden places that ordinary people cannot reach. Because it once proved Lady Martha wrong. Although Mother did not care, it did not mean that we children could easily accept it. It was the same for the Bugas. And the Bronze Generation was the monsters scattered across the earth. In the past, on the earth, other than the glorious folk of order, there were the dusk seeds of chaos. Monsters that are between order and chaos do not exist in this world. Freya was completely stunned. She knew about the Gold Folk, the Silver Folk, and the Black Iron Folk. But she had never heard of the original monsters, the Bronze Folk between silver and black iron. But how could this be? She subconsciously rubbed her forehead, feeling a little dizzy. The owner of the voice obviously noticed this too. He asked, do you feel a little incredulous? Freya nodded. Then we'll have to start with the order of the ancient times. Ko Hua's cold voice echoed over the hall. Before the world of Wond was born in the light, the divine folk and Martha first appeared in the chaos, the supreme beings. With the help of Martha, the divine folk weaved this world and created 17,000 gods to manage this world. Then the gods created the gold folk from the blood and corpses of the divine folk. This is the origin of the gold folk. The gold folk were servants but also warriors. They were staunch guardians of order. Then there was the silver folk. The silver folk was created because of the contract between Martha and the 4 elemental sovereigns. With the elements as their bodies, they were created with the blood of the gold folk. The silver folk were thousands of people. They lived in the kingdom on the earth and were the subjects of order. This was the ancient classical order and the most glorious era. Babel's tower stood in the center of the world, monitoring the earth. There was a fortress above each of the 4 realms of the kingdom. Valhalla and Avalon were just 2 of them. Legend has it that the ground of that era was paved with silver, the sky shone with the light of diamonds, the trees bore golden fruits, and the rivers flowed with rich milk. But such a glorious dynasty still fell in the twilight. In the next 2 eras the divine folk rebuilt the world twice, but what was the result? The divine folk died one by one, and all the wisdom of the ancient times was only a few words to this day. The most glorious victory of civilization over the Twilight Dragon came from the last war. Just as she said this word by word, the entire spiral hall was uncontrollably capsizing under the control of some kind of force. The central platform had been completely distorted under the great force, and more than 10 long bridges were twisted into a fried dough twist and pulled into the abyss below. Brando was saved by this sudden change, but he immediately realized that he had just escaped the wolf's den and entered the tiger's mouth. The reason for all of this was because of Ko Hua's previous actions. When everyone's attention was focused on the fierce battle in the middle, Brando and the little female dragon happened to be attacking Erek, causing chaos on this side. The eldest daughter of Ekis took this opportunity to fly towards Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles. She only symbolically exchanged blows with Mephistopheles in midair before her waist was slashed by the Ash Sword Saint. Just as Mephistopheles was still wondering why this demigod-level existence in the Chaos era was so weak, Ko Hua borrowed the strength of the Ash Sword Saint's attack and fell in a certain direction. The direction she fell was the center of the hall, and behind her, other than the throne on the platform, there was only the purple crystal suspended in midair. The battle was so intense that both sides did not have the time to see where Ko Hua fell, but it was this neglect that gave her the greatest opportunity. The moment she approached the purple crystal, Ko Hua turned back in midair and grabbed the purple crystal with her claws. If Mephistopheles had noticed Ko Hua's subtle movements, he would have been wary of her previous fake miss, because the strength of this grab was so terrifying that it was at least at the peak of the law. Under the claw, the crystal suddenly shattered into pieces. Then in an instant, the scene of Brando dodging the sword of the Lizardman Blademaster happened. The spiral hall shook violently, and then the whole floor spun and sank down. All the long bridges above the abyss were pulled into a long thin belt. Except for a few people who had the ability to fly or magic, most people, including the black-robed knights, lost their footing and fell down at the first moment. At this time, Brando knew that something was wrong. He looked up and could barely see across the hall that Scarlet had stabbed the azure lance in her hand into the wall. Fortunately, she did not fall, but the figures of Lorena and her husband could no longer be seen in the crowd, not to mention the young prince and the eldest prince of the Cruise people. The Shire people were also out of touch. Brando tried to communicate with them telepathically, but only felt a noise coming from below. Something was interfering with the spiritual world of everyone in this hall, and in this place he could only think of one thing. In just a moment he saw a huge mouth suddenly emerge from the darkness below. It was something like a giant sandworm, with thousands of teeth in its huge open mouth. Brando knew at a glance what it was: the Frost Devourer. This damn thing was here. It turned out that it did not live in the glacier, but was locked under this hall. He should have thought of it. But he grabbed the edge of the long bridge with one hand, looked up and looked at Ko Hua in the air with some confusion. He somewhat understood what the eldest daughter of Ekis wanted to do. In the game he had never heard of such a thing. I have personally experienced that war. Ko Hua floated in the air and finally finished this last sentence. Her eyes were a little blurred, as if she was reminiscing. P.S. Second update. Today is another 10,000 words a day. Everyone, don't just wait and see, please give it your all. Do you want to continue reading the 10,000 words tomorrow? Hurry up. Give me some motivation. Roll. Chapter 8:18. Ko Hua seemed to have suddenly gone mad, turning the battlefield into such a mess without distinguishing between friend and foe. She then floated above the hall and said some crazy things. Brando grabbed the bridge to prevent himself from falling. He looked up and saw the lizardman sword saint at a place higher than him, also holding onto the wall, but the other hand was carrying Duke Arek. Brando glanced around and didn't see where the little female dragon was. He didn't know if she had succeeded, but the star-shaped stone in Arek's hand had disappeared. Looking at his exasperated face, it was either lost or taken away. The black-robed knight that Arek brought with him had long been scattered. Except for those who were extremely lucky, most of the survivors were existences above elemental activation. Brando counted, including the few who were still floating in the center of the hall, there were as many as 11 in total. Even if 2 or 3 lucky ones were excluded, there were still 8 or 9. This number was already extremely terrifying, knowing that there was still Devard outside who was tricked by him. The elemental activation powerhouses gathered here today had already surpassed the entire upper level of Erwin's power. The situation in the hall now was like this. At the top of the hall, only Mephisto was there, and a little below was Veronica and the black-robed knight from All for One who had previously fought with her. There were about 4 or 5 of them. Further below, floating next to the broken purple crystal, was Ko Hua, who was muttering to herself. The platform under her feet where Milos's throne was placed had already collapsed under the impact of the huge force and rolled into the abyss. Almost none of the All for One wizards on the platform were spared. Only the elemental awakened wizard later staggered up from below, obviously also suffering from serious injuries. Around the hall, the black-robed knight and the noble knight of Erwin who had previously occupied the long bridges suffered heavy losses. Except for a few who reacted quickly and were still hanging on the cliff, most of them had already fallen down. The hall was filled with smoke and dust. Except for Arek, the lizardman sword saint, and Scarlet, Brando did not find any other familiar figures. He was very worried about the safety of the Shire, Medisha, and the little prince, especially when the huge mouth of the frost devourer below was rising little by little. The countless teeth inside were spinning like a meat grinder. Those who fell were obviously doomed. After the destructive force that swept across the hall disappeared, the lines of law began to stabilize again. Brando soon felt that he had regained the ability to fly, so he let go of the bridge and flew up. However, he did not dare to get too close to the Red Ring Lizardman Sword Saint. From the sword strike just now, he felt that the Red Ring Lizardman Sword Saint was more threatening than Veronica when she was in the loop of trade winds. Although the strength of the two were about the same, one was good at defensive swordsmanship, while the other was good at offensive swordsmanship. The difference was obvious at a glance. And since the star-shaped stone was no longer in Arek's hands, Brando did not intend to stay here for long. Under the cover of the smoke, he carefully flew in the direction of Scarlet. The hall was buzzing, and there were obvious cracks on the surrounding walls, indicating that there might be a second collapse. Brando suspected that this time, the dome of the spiral hall would also collapse. If that was the case, he could not stay here for long. Ko Hua, what are you doing? It was at this moment that Arek's low and hoarse roar came from behind. No one thought that Ko Hua would choose this moment to retaliate. She had hidden her claws and fangs earlier because she was waiting for the right time. The demons were right when they said that this woman was unruly. Arek's face turned ashen, but it was too late for regrets. Ko Hua had single-handedly turned the entire battlefield into a mess and completely ruined his plan. Don't you dare imprison me, human. Ko Hua smiled proudly. Didn't you want to see the awakening god? You will see him soon. What do you mean? Ko Hua did not answer. Her face suddenly showed an expression of extreme pain. She opened her mouth slightly and screamed. A cloud of black smoke came out of her mouth, followed by her eyes, nostrils, and ears. The billowing black smoke gathered above the girl and formed a vague human figure. Meanwhile, Ko Hua hung her head weakly and curled up in the air. Her skin was so pale that it was almost bloodless, like an empty shell that had lost its strength and soul. You don't understand what happened in that war, human. A thunderous voice came from the billowing black smoke. Ko Hua's cold voice could be vaguely heard. That was the only time in several eras that the dusk was defeated. That's impossible. Erek roared. After the Battle of Ebabel, even the gods were defeated. Almost all of the golden race died, and the silver race hid themselves. This is the greatest victory of the chaos in history. The Duke raised his arms and roared crazily. What's left of Wone today? The gods had long since abandoned this land, and the most glorious era had passed. What was left was just a bunch of lowly insects. When dusk came again, what could these trash use to resist? They are still fighting for power and profit. They are drunk for some temporary illusions. Such a group of people, is this the so-called civilization? At the end, he was almost contemptuous. It's ridiculous. There was a moment of silence in the hall, but the fanatical chanting of prayers by the believers of All for One could faintly be heard. You're crazy, Erek. Veronica had never thought that a person could be this crazy. She never believed in the fallacy of All for One. The war between the Twilight Dragon and the gods was already a distant memory. Only those evil cultists with evil intentions would hold these illusory myths as holy scriptures. She did not know what the future of Wone would be. Maybe it would be destroyed or maybe it would continue. But these were not important. For humans with short lives, the most important thing was the present. Just like for her, as long as the crew's empire still existed, she had to fight for it, whether it was for her family or for the empire itself. Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles also shook his head. It's ridiculous. The voice in the black smoke sneered. Who told you that the gods left Wone after their failure? Who told you that the golden race all died on the battlefield of the dusk? The silver race hid, not because they were disheartened. Some of the human legends that have been passed down to this day are not groundless. It's just that you don't want to believe it. But there's one thing you're right about. The voice in the black smoke sighed. Wone today is indeed no longer the classical and glorious era. When the power was handed over to the mortals, the era of the gods was gone and never to return. Brando was quietly passing through the smoke-filled area at the bottom of the hall. He would soon return to the place where he first entered the hall, the other side of Erek's direction. The debate between the two sides was going on fiercely above the hall. This scene was a bit like the lengthy opening speech of many important bosses in the game, but a solemn atmosphere indeed shrouded the entire hall. Everyone could feel a storm of energy gathering out of thin air. Brando felt it and realized that the key to summoning the awakening god was actually Ko Hua, and it seemed that no one in the game had actually pulled Ko Hua to this place. But this design was indeed a pain in the ass. Although it seemed to make sense in terms of the plot, Brando could not help but curse in his heart. He glanced down and saw that the Frost Devourer had risen another 100 feet. It was almost within reach. This discovery startled him, and he hurriedly flew up a few more times. Ko Hua, Veronica, and the others were almost above him, but he dared not fly up and let others find out, especially Ko Hua. Who knew if this demigod-like existence would hold a grudge against him? This is an era where everyone chooses their own destiny. Take care of yourselves. The voice in the black smoke still echoed. Under the black smoke, Corfa's eyelashes fluttered slightly. Don't, she whispered softly. The black smoke sighed. You're free, Ko Hua. And I will be reborn. Mephisto's face suddenly changed. Get out of the way, he shouted. As soon as his voice fell, the black smoke that shrouded Ko Hua's head suddenly spread out and rose to the dome of the hall. A few black-robed knights who could not dodge in time were sucked in, and before they could let out a scream, they completely disappeared without a trace. Assimilation. Veronica's face also changed. This was the most typical power of chaos. She hurriedly flew up diagonally, but unfortunately, it was still a little too late. Ko Hua's dark soul rose very quickly and was about to wrap her up, but at this time the female commander felt someone tugging at her from above, dragging her out of the area where she would surely die. Veronica's face turned pale, and when she looked back, she found that it was Mephisto who pulled her out. She was a little surprised, but then a blush appeared on her pale face. She frowned and complained. Where's your aristocratic etiquette, Mr. Mephisto? How can you grab a lady's hair? Mephisto did not answer, but just looked at her. Thank you. The female commander was stunned for a moment, then replied in a low voice. Drastic changes were taking place in the hall. The black smoke had completely merged into the dome, and the voice let out a burst of arrogant laughter. The bell-like laughter lingered in the hall for a long time, but the changes did not stop there. The sound of resonance in the hall was getting louder and louder. Brando saw that several long bridges had been completely broken and fell into the abyss below. They were bitten by the frost devourer that was climbing up from below. The latter had a good appetite and was not picky at all. Whether it was stone or metal, it was all happily accepted. It was like a gradually approaching black hole. Long cracks crisscrossed the walls of the hall, some of which were already several inches wide. The entire hall was on the verge of collapse. Large chunks of rock fell from above, and in a short while a skylight was opened in the dome. However, outside the skylight was not a bright sky, but a dark mountain. In fact, the whole mountain was shaking at this moment. The rock wall split into two parts, and half of it had begun to sink slowly. F***CK. Brando finally reacted. This was a landslide. Get out of here. He looked around and finally found the exit that he came in from before. With just a glance, the place was already like a sand castle, with mud and sand falling down, and then falling apart into a pile of ruins. There were a total of 17 arches in the hall, and it seemed that half of them were gone in the blink of an eye. While Brando was stunned, the remaining one-third disappeared. He hurriedly flew to the last few remaining exits, but it was at this time that he felt something hit him from above, causing him to sink down. The thing made a muffled sound, and it was a girl's voice. There were no women on Arek's side. Brando subconsciously thought it was one of Medisha, Scarlet, or Shido, but the voice was not very familiar. He thought it might be Miss Scholar, so he pulled her into his arms. But with this delay, the last few arches had all disappeared. Brando looked at it and suddenly wanted to cry. At this time, the whole hall had obviously reached the end of its long life. The walls in all directions were falling towards him, and there was no way to avoid it. At some point, the buzzing sound that seemed to come from the depths of the mountain became louder and louder, but Freya did not notice it. She quietly listened to Milo's story. It was a long story, and it seemed to bring her thoughts to that distant and glorious era. Tall towers towering in the sky, floating palaces, the golden people in white linen robes, prostrating themselves outside the palaces made of gold, and the air seemed to be filled with the faint smell of vanilla. It was a world of order and civilization, but now humans seemed to be struggling in ignorance. After a long time, she blinked slightly, looked up and asked, "In other words, the gods gave the power to choose their fate to the mortals. After that, the Azure Knight led the ancestors and defeated the Twilight Dragon. After the stars fell, in order to fulfill the agreement, the gods left Wonde and completely handed this land over to us. That glorious era is gone, and today's Wonde is an era where we choose our own fate, whether it is destruction or rebirth in the future." "You are very smart," the gentle voice replied, "but there is still something I don't understand. Why can we do things that the gods can't do?" The room was silent for a moment. "Because you are the people of this world, and you don't have to fight against it." Freya was slightly startled. "I'm sorry, I don't understand the meaning of this sentence. I remember telling you that half of the Iron folk's blood flows in your veins, but unlike the Bronze folk, you have completely given up on your powers. That's why you didn't turn into those demonic creatures whose rationality was corroded by darkness." Freya nodded. "That is the reason." The voice replied. "The world of Wonde was weaved by Martha from chaos. When she placed the law of Tiamat above the sea of chaos, the world was born. The root of our world comes from the order that is built on top of chaos. Therefore, since the birth of the world, this opposition has been rooted in it. The stronger the power of order, the stronger the resistance from chaos. However, the power of chaos has no limit. In other words, one day this power will even surpass the control of the gods, and our world will also be reduced to ashes. This is the origin of dusk. In several eras, Wonde has already experienced destruction several times, and the history of the earliest gold people is long gone. This is the so-called mistake of the gods. In countless eras, the sages and wise men of the gods and other servant races have been looking for a way to end this cycle of mistakes. We have built countless civilizations and orders, but every time, without exception, we have failed. The twilight has come 6 times, and we have failed 6 times. And the only time that we were closest to success was at the end of the last era. Your hero, the Knight of the Azure Sky, broke the sky, causing the stars to fall to the earth. Wand was separated because of this, but at the same time it really ended the twilight. This was the only time that the civilization was not completely destroyed. Although it still suffered a heavy blow, at least it let us see the possibility of success. The root of all this was a suggestion from the Darkness Dragon. Is it Odin? Freya suddenly interrupted. No, it was earlier than him. Although she could not see, the girl could feel the owner of the voice slowly shaking his head. The Darkness Dragon of the previous generation had already fallen in the Battle of the Twilight. But like Odin, he was a person with extraordinary wisdom. He was the one who asked us to think about this problem instead of blindly increasing the power of order. What we had to do was only to preserve the fire of civilization. Therefore, we could have created a weak civilization that was no longer glorious. It could even be said that it had compromised with chaos. It lacked power, was ignorant, and was even penetrated full of holes by the Twilight Dragon. But because of this, we almost succeeded. Because even chaos cannot devour itself. Freya opened her mouth slightly. She vaguely felt that Milos seemed to be hiding something. But what this voice said was already the most ridiculous legend she had ever heard. The gods actually compromised with the Twilight Dragon. No matter how bad it is, it's fine as long as it exists. Freya was a little uncomfortable. After all, no one wanted to be treated like a bug. No, little girl, civilization will grow. Milos' voice became a little proud. This is the greatness of Mother. This time it will be a civilization rooted in this world. It will no longer be created or interfered with by us. It will carry the mark of the Twilight Dragon and grow little by little. It will gradually grow stronger and finally merge with the origin of this world. By then, no one will be able to destroy it. But civilization was civilization, and order was, after all, different from chaos. Freya vaguely felt that something was wrong. She shook her head. Then will the Twilight Dragon still descend? The voice was silent for a moment. It will. P.S. First update, please vote. Chapter 8:19. We will. Freya slowly sat back in her chair, her hands clutching her knees uneasily. After a while she asked in a low voice, "Then what do we do? What do we use to fight against the Twilight Dragon? This time the Golden Race is no longer around us. Even the Silver Race has retreated from the world. Without a hero like the Azure Knight to lead us, we are barehanded, and we are even caught in a battle with each other. When the twilight comes, will we still have a chance?" Milos did not answer, and a spark burst out in the bright flames of the fireplace. Time was like sand in an hourglass, passing bit by bit, and the space quietly reverberated with a dull buzzing sound. As for the road ahead, the future is shrouded in fog for you and me. Not only me, but even a wise man like Crystal does not dare to say that he knows all the secrets of the universe. Even the gods can't. Even Mother doesn't know everything. Freya opened her mouth. But as long as you still control your destiny, then you still have a chance. The generation of Black Iron must firmly control your destiny in your own hands. This is the last blessing that Mother has given you. This is the era of mortals. Neither the gods nor the Twilight Dragon can interfere. Whether the future is good or bad, it is up to you to decide. Is this why you chose us to come here, Lord Milos? The night girl took a light breath, and finally understood the purpose of the father of the frost giants. In such an era, no matter what the reason was, there was no need for an awakened god, because the gods had long gone like dust and smoke, and only existed in the long scroll of history. "You are very smart," the voice repeated. "What should I do?" Freya asked softly. "As I said, use the long sword in your hand to kill it." Freya widened her eyes slightly. She had always thought that it was a joke, but this time the voice was serious. "But how can I do it, kill a god?" She could not help but blurt out. "Little girl, in your era there are no more gods. No matter how they are revived or what kind of identity they have, the moment they appear in this world, they are destined to be a fake god." The voice sighed and paused for a moment. "And you, Freya, this is your era." Freya stared blankly at the opposite side of the table. On the empty chair, there seemed to be a wise elder sitting there. And in this short period of time, he had already told her a long story. There were many things that she didn't need to know. Gotcha. A long crack suddenly appeared on the floor of the room, and the low humming sound finally converged into a sharp roar. The entire mountain shook as though it was sinking slowly, and even the floor of the room was tilting. Freya was almost thrown out of her seat. She quickly held onto the table and looked in that direction in shock. Looks like this place is about to disappear. The voice paused for a moment, then chuckled. Lord Milos? Freya, remember my words. I'll be waiting for you. Freya held her breath. Perhaps she didn't want to, or perhaps she deliberately ignored this point. It was as if she suddenly remembered that the frost giant's father wanted her to kill himself. Amidst the rumbling sounds, the cabin in the glacier was tilting more and more, just like the cabin before it sank. Even the walls were starting to crack like a spider web. The ground was falling apart, as if it was going to disappear completely in the blink of an eye. Freya grabbed the edge of the table tightly and stared at the empty chair. Lord Milos, do you want to say goodbye, little girl? No, it's not. Freya shook her head, struggling to keep her balance. She managed to straighten herself and bowed deeply to the chair. She wanted to say thank you, but sometimes there was no need to say this sentence. 1,000 words were better than silence. A crack that ran through the entire ceiling appeared above the girl's head, and the ground under her feet began to sink freely, cracking and protruding, revealing the ice below. There's no need for that. The voice smiled slightly, as if shaking its head. There's no need for that. But before children go alone, they should always tell their elders that they are safe. The girl knight straightened up, rubbed her eyes, and replied with a smile. Thank you. Then let's meet again in history. The voice fell silent, and a white halo spread out from Freya's body. This faint light bounced off all the ice that fell on the girl, making her seem to be able to stand upright in this collapsed room. And just in Freya's vision, the round table was sliding to one side, and opposite it, the empty chair suddenly flipped backward, and then was swallowed by the shattered ice and disappeared. Thank you, she answered softly in her heart. In the next moment, the collapsing layer of ice slanted down, burying everything in this place in darkness. He didn't know how much time had passed in the darkness. Brando lay quietly on a glacier like a blind and deaf man. The cold and slippery feeling under his body told him that there was thick ice on his left and right, and perhaps some snow. But other than that, there was only darkness. About a few feet away there was a soft breathing sound. Other than his own breathing, this soft breathing sound was particularly jarring in the silence. He didn't know how long he had been lying there, and he didn't know how many times he had tried, but he was pleasantly surprised to find that he could finally control his numb limbs. First it was his fingers, then his wrist, and finally his entire arm. He gritted his teeth and used his arm to support himself, and after a few minutes, he finally regained feeling in his legs. Then he tried to get up from the ground, but just as he raised his head hit the ceiling. It was a very narrow space. This was Brando's first thought. Where was this place? This was his second thought, and the ability to think seemed to have gradually returned to his frozen brain. He gradually recalled everything that happened before he fainted. Ko Hua seemed to have used his dark soul to awaken the awakening god, and the key to everything was the purple crystal suspended on the platform. Then the entire spiral hall collapsed. This was something that had never happened in the game, and now this place should be under the abyss of the spiral hall, right? Oh right, what about the frost devourer? He remembered the huge worm. He thought that he would be eaten by it when he fell, but he didn't expect to be lucky enough to escape with his life. It was a pity that he didn't have the light source on him, and he used up all his mana when he was fighting with Devard. Otherwise, he could at least cast a spell to check the surroundings instead of guessing. Brando thought for a moment, and decided to check out the place first. He remembered that when he was lying on the ground, there was another breathing sound not far away, so he immediately lowered his body and groped in that direction. But after a few steps, his hand touched a soft body that was still warm. Fortunately, you don't seem to be dead. Brando groped the other person's body for a while, and suddenly found that something was wrong. He grabbed it with his hand and finally confirmed that it seemed to be a woman. This discovery startled him, and just as he was about to stop, the other person seemed to have woken up and made a soft hum sound. It was an unfamiliar girl's voice. Brando's heart skipped a beat, and he hurriedly let go of his hand and asked guiltily, "Miss Shido, There was no response in the darkness, and Brando only saw the other person open her eyes. Don't ask him how he knew the other person opened her eyes. Because it was a pair of silver eyes that shone brightly in the darkness. At that moment, cold sweat fell from Brando's forehead. Silver people, gold people? Damn, no way could it be Allah's? Is it such a coincidence that I touched her first? Brando couldn't believe that if he touched Allah's body, he would be laughed at by the little female dragon. Maybe something like a pervert or something like that would come out of the mouth. And this was secondary. What if she flew into a rage again? Or what if she burst into tears again? Allah's previous performance in the spiral hall had left a deep impression on him. But he immediately shook his head. No, this was not Allah's. Allah's eyes were the kind of golden pupils with light silver, the typical eyes of the gold people. And the pair in front of him, said to be the eyes of the silver people, did not look like it, but because the eyes of the silver people were not so light, this pair of eyes somewhat resembled the eyes of Princess Griffine. But of course Princess Griffine was not here. Could it be the little prince? Brando's cold sweat increased. It was ridiculous enough for him to let the little prince dress in women's clothing, and now this was a joke. He did not know how the other party would view him as a teacher. But that was not right. How could the little prince have breasts? Brando immediately realized that he had misunderstood. He suddenly remembered that he seemed to have caught a girl before he fell. He thought it was Shido at first, but now it seemed that his guess was wrong. Thinking of this, Brando took a step back and looked at the other party quietly. He could not be sure whether the other party was a friend or foe. It was better to wait for the other party to react first. Unexpectedly, just as he stepped back, he heard a voice like an orchid in an empty valley ask, "How did you recognize me at that time? I mean, how did you recognize my human form?" This sentence was like a bolt of lightning. It struck Brando right on the top of his head, directly freezing him there. Wei Ko Hua? Yes. The silver eyes blinked gently, as if disappearing for a moment in the darkness and then reappearing again. That was my previous name. I haven't used this name for a long time. My name is now Ko Hua. You can call me Ko Hua. That was not right. Brando thought to himself, that was not right. The first running wolf that appeared in the twilight, the eldest daughter of Ekis as a twilight wolf, should not have a pair of blood-red eyes. And the voice should also be the cold tone that he was familiar with before. But what was going on with the one in front of him? Could it be Allah's prank? No, absolutely not. If it was the little female dragon, she would never make such an obvious mistake in the color of her eyes. It was not that difficult to change the color of her eyes with magic. He frowned and could not help but ask, Are you really Ko Hua? The eldest daughter of Ekis, the first running wolf in the twilight, one of the supreme monsters? The silver eyes moved up and down. This was because it was nodding. Brando took a breath of cold air. At this moment he finally reacted. This was not Ko Hua, this was Ko Hua's good side. However, this understanding made him fall into confusion. What was going on? Ko Hua's dark side became the awakening god, and her original body was only left with the good side. That is to say, the eldest daughter of the Twilight Wolves did not have dual personalities, but a true body with two souls. He suddenly remembered what she called Ko Hua before, sister. This script was not right, Brando secretly exclaimed. The dark side of Ko Hua became the awakening god, and the good side of Ko Hua also survived. This was not the same as history. Brando remembered in the history of the game, Ko Hua's dark side and good side perished together, and after the holy cathedral of the Hibernator dungeon, the identity of Ekis' eldest daughter no longer existed. But now what was going on? History had inexplicably changed. Could it be that this was the original setting of the game? If the awakening god was resurrected, then it would enter this historical line. If the awakening god could not be resurrected, then it would enter that historical line in the game. Brando suddenly had a little realization. No wonder no one in the game had ever seen the awakening god. It turned out that history had long been changed, and the result had been written down. But now there was a problem. No, it should be a big problem. Brando realized that their group seemed to have inadvertently changed history, and it was not like the history of Ampere Seal and Erwin only changed. The eldest daughter of Ekis, the dark side of Ko Hua, the difference between such an existence and a mere aristocratic meeting in Erwin did not need to be elaborated. It was clear which was more important. And if Brando remembered correctly, the next big chapter after the birth of the Empire was the return of Ekis. This was a change that could even affect the entire course of the great demonic wave, and even change the future direction of Woned, shaking the foundation of the terrible war in the future. More importantly, this change was different from the one in Ampere Seal, and was triggered inadvertently, even completely beyond his expectations, and no one knew whether this change was good or bad. Brando could only be sure of one thing, and that was that in the game, Ekis was killed by players because before Ekis was resurrected, his 12 daughters were also killed one after another, and the process was almost the same as killing Ko Hua in the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator. And now, Ko Hua survived, so what about Ekis? And if Ekis did not die, what would Woned become? Brando could only think of 5 words. The dusk of the world. He just stared at Ko Hua in a daze, his mind in a mess, and for a moment he even forgot to reply to the other party. After a while, Ko Hua opened her mouth to break the silence. She said softly, "I seem to have scared you, right?" Brando's heart skipped a beat, and he quickly shook his head. "Then why have you been in a daze?" "Because I'm thinking about whether to kill you or not," Brando answered seriously. "Ah." Ko Hua was shocked, but she seemed a little puzzled. "Why do you want to kill me, Mr. Human?" Brando was silent for a moment. In fact, he was not joking, but he really did have such thoughts in his heart. "Because you are Ekis' daughter, the first wolf in the dusk, and in the not-too-distant future, your mother will be resurrected again. And if you are still alive at that time, it will be unfortunate news for humans. If you are alive, many people will die." Ko Hua blinked her eyes. "You seem to be a prophet. Nothing can be hidden from you, Mr. Human." She paused for a moment. "My mother once told me that in the darkness that no one can see, there is a river that quietly flows, and that river flows to an unknown future. Those who can see that river can see the end of the future. Mr. Human, can you tell me why do you seem to be able to see everything behind the fog?" Brando pursed his lips. Because of some special reasons. The killing intent in his heart had already risen, so he did not hide it anymore. Moreover, lying all the time was very tiring, so telling this to Ko Hua made him feel very relaxed. He exhaled. The kind Ko Hua was very popular among the players, and he did not have any bad feelings towards this seemingly simple little girl. But her existence was a threat to Woned, and she clearly understood this, so he was not surprised. And the more this was the case, the more nervous Brando became, because this proved that his guess might be correct. "You are telling me this because it is your secret, Mr. Human," the girl replied faintly, appearing very calm. "The reason you are telling me this is because you know that I can keep your secret, right?" Brando nodded. The kind Ko Hua was very smart, and had already guessed what he was thinking. "But what if there is a third person here who heard our conversation?" Ko Hua asked again. Brando was terrified. He knew that Ko Hua was not just saying empty words to scare him. Since Ko Hua said this, there must be a meaning behind it. He quickly turned his head, and at this time Ko Hua had already chanted a spell. Suddenly, light appeared in the dark underground. Brando squinted his eyes under this sudden light, and then he finally saw the battered and exhausted person sitting not far away in the ice cave. Anrek! Brando's heart surged with an incomparably strange feeling. Ko Hua, Anrek, and himself. In this small space there were 3 of them gathered. It was really a case of enemies meeting on a narrow path. But he immediately felt a little strange. This place was so big, and at such a close distance with his perception, how could he not have noticed the breathing of a third person? Even if he did not notice it before, there was no reason why he would not have noticed it after waking up. Thinking of this, he turned his head, and saw that there was a little mischievous slyness in Ko Hua's eyes. "I used a little trick, Mr. Human. You won't blame me, right?" Being played by a real demigod. Brando was so angry that he almost laughed. He pointed at the battered and exhausted Anrek and asked straightforwardly, "You are counting on him to save your life? If it was anyone else it would be fine, but this person seems to be my enemy, right? P.S. 10,000 delivered at the second watch. Where is the promise ticket today?" Chapter 820. The magical ball of light illuminated the surroundings, and the pale white light outlined the uneven contours of the ice surface, forming an inverted bowl-shaped ice chamber, narrow and quiet. In response to Brando's question, Ko Hua only looked at him with a slight smile, her eyes calm, neither arguing nor refuting. On the other side, Arek half leaned against the ice wall without saying a word. He had hit his forehead, and his wrinkled face was full of blood, looking extremely miserable. Do I really have to stab her with my sword? If she's a ferocious monster, I won't feel any psychological burden, but she's just a harmless little girl. Even though her existence could lead to a very bad future, causing many people to lose their homes, friends, and family, it's just a possibility. If the girl was eager to argue, he might think that she had ulterior motives, but Ko Hua was very smart. She did not say a word, but instead appeared calm, making Brando unable to do anything. Brando had already held his sword in his hand, but in the end he sighed and put down the dark blade. He could not kill someone because of a groundless possibility. He was still too soft-hearted. Brando could not help but shake his head. If Amandina saw this, she would definitely privately warn him that a person who wanted to achieve great things should not be too wishy-washy. But he did not know that Amandina had always been loyal to him because he was different from the other nobles. After all, Amandina's heart was not made of stone, but she was afraid that he would be consigned to eternal damnation by the cold-blooded noble's schemes. A disdainful snort came from behind. Brando looked back and saw Arek's unkempt face that looked like a beggar's, but his expression was full of contempt, as if he did not care about his soft-heartedness. His heart was filled with anger, and his guts grew. I can't do anything to Ko Hua, but you think I can't do anything to you? Your hands are stained with the blood of Erewhon's people, and your actions in Ampere Seal have completely pushed him to the opposite side of civilization. Under the rule of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, just colluding with the demons is a serious crime, not to mention luring the demon army to the surface and stealing the portal of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. You almost destroyed the port of Ampere Seal with hundreds of thousands of people. Any one of these crimes is enough to kill you 10,000 times over. Brando stared coldly at the once all-powerful Duke of Erewhon. At the same time, Arek raised his head and looked at him. His eyeballs twitched under his long eyebrows. With just one sentence, he immediately made Brando freeze on the spot. The Dark Dragon? Brando sucked in a breath of cold air, and almost couldn't resist nailing this guy to the ice with his sword. What did you say? As far as I know, there is only one person who can see through the fog of history, Arek replied slowly. That is the Dark Dragon foretold by the witches. Fighting with someone who walked in front of history, my defeat is not unjustified. He closed his eyes as if he had accepted his fate. This guy seems to be certain that I am the Dark Dragon. Brando was a little speechless. He wondered if the witches in the snow country of Bunasan had any sense of confidentiality. How could their prophecies be known by everyone? Weren't they afraid that the Holy Cathedral of Fire would find the successor of the Dark Dragon and kill him first? But he immediately realized that there seemed to be a problem with this thought. In the Dark Prophecy, the Dark Dragon who had returned to Wond was omniscient and omnipotent. He could see through the fog of history. Since he was so powerful, he naturally wouldn't be killed by the Holy Cathedral of Fire. If the Dark Dragon died, it would only prove that he wasn't the real Dark Dragon. This was a King paradox. Brando finally experienced the strength of these guys who wrote the prophecies. Anyway, both sides of the prophecy made sense. It just depended on how one wanted to interpret it. Just like Arek at this moment, Brando suddenly understood the other party's thoughts. This duke was arrogant and unwilling to admit that he had lost to a mortal, so he simply believed that he was the Dark Dragon. Anyway, this was the only way to explain his previous conversation with Ko Hua. Of course, this kind of stubborn conjecture was just a joke to the average person. They just had to laugh it off. But for Brando it was a bit of a fluke. First of all, he had the inheritance of the Dark Dragon. Although this thing was hidden very well, it wasn't completely impossible for the Holy Cathedral of Fire to find out if they wanted to. Secondly, the ability to predict the future that he displayed seemed to be the only explanation that could be explained by the rumors of the Dark Prophecy. However, he knew that the reason for this was not because he was omniscient and omnipotent, but because he had transmigrated from the future. But the problem was, who would believe it? Another thing that puzzled Brando was why Arek looked like he had accepted his fate. In his understanding, this duke was definitely a guy who wouldn't give in until the last moment. He didn't look like a dejected loser who seemed to have suffered a setback. As far as he knew, this Duke Arek had a rich life and it wasn't all smooth sailing from his birth to where he was today. He had encountered countless setbacks, big and small. In his youth, he even lost his beloved woman because of the battle for the inheritance of the title. Brando once suspected that it was this reason that drove him to madness and paranoia, where he gave up his title of Duke and ran off to become a cultist. And in any case, compared to these experiences, this defeat to Erek wasn't considered a huge setback in his life. Who was this Duke acting like this for? There were only 2 people here with him and Ko Hua. Ko Hua definitely couldn't save him. Was he trying to retreat in order to advance? Did this Duke really think that he was so soft-hearted that he didn't dare to kill? Brando frowned. It definitely wasn't that simple. He couldn't help but take a closer look at Erek. His gaze quickly froze and stopped at Erek's hand. Duke Erek's hand didn't look like the hand of a duke at all. It was weather-beaten, which was in line with his identity as a soldier. But this wasn't the main point. The main point was the ring on his index finger that was shining faintly. It was a ring in the shape of a snake. The ring snake ring. So this was the key. Brando said in his heart that it was close. He almost forgot about this thing. This thing had brought him a lot of trouble when he first came to this world. He didn't forget the purpose of this ring. If he accidentally killed Erek here today, the news that he was the Darkness Dragon would immediately be known by the higher-ups of All for One. The Darkness Dragon was the mortal enemy of the 4 sages. But the saying that an enemy's enemy was a friend was not universal. The relationship between the Darkness Dragon and the Twilight Believers was also like fire and water. All for One would definitely be happy to see him fight with the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Thinking of this, Brando couldn't help but break out in a cold sweat. So this was what this guy was thinking. He put the ring in the most conspicuous place to warn him. What's wrong? Erek saw the change in Brando's expression and asked, "Is the Darkness Dragon so soft-hearted that he doesn't dare to kill?" "That's not the case. He just took a fancy to your ring. How about this? You take off the ring and give it to me. I'll give you a quick death and reluctantly arrange for you to meet your master, the Twilight Dragon." Brando replied snappily. Erek laughed, as if he had finally recovered from his previous embarrassing state. "No need to be so troublesome. This is just an ordinary ring. There is no problem with magic dissipation. You can kill me with a sword and then come and take it yourself." Old fox. Brando cursed in his heart. This was a typical case of taking advantage of others and pretending to be innocent. Little rascal. Erek was also cursing. He couldn't help but be glad that there was still Ekis' eldest daughter here, allowing him to get hold of the other party's weakness. Otherwise, in his current state, he might have executed Brando on the spot. However, Brando's sharp reaction also made him secretly shocked. He originally thought that he would have to threaten him personally, but he didn't expect the other party to understand the cause and effect just by taking a look at his ring. This not only required brains, but also a deep understanding of the internal structure of All for One. Where did such a monster come from? Erek couldn't help but be puzzled. Of course, Erek couldn't be killed. Fortunately, as long as he was still in his hands, he wouldn't dare to reveal the secret easily. Otherwise, his only means of survival would be gone. Brando was already well aware that this Archduke Erek would definitely not be willing to die like this. If he hadn't seen the ring snake ring earlier, the other party would most likely have taken the initiative to remind him, or simply threatened him directly. His purpose was to live, not to reveal the information of who the Darkness Dragon was. Now that the two could be said to have grasped each other's weaknesses and thoughts, they were also afraid of each other for a while, but instead reached a certain balance. Although they didn't say it out loud, they had a tacit understanding. Brando simply ignored this old fellow Erek. Besides, there were still many empty places in the dungeon of Castle Abes. When they reached his territory, he had plenty of ways to make the ring ineffective. As for what thoughts were in Erek's mind, he couldn't care less. In any case, Erek believed that the Darkness Dragon was his greatest reliance, but in fact Brando's trump card was far more than that. Since Erek was willing to go down this path to the end, he might as well beat him at his own game and send him on his way. Both of them had their own ulterior motives. Brando turned to look at Ko Hua, who was lying on the ground, watching this scene with interest. Brando asked, "How do you want me to deal with you, Miss Ko Hua, the princess of the Dusk Clan?" "You don't have to call me that." Ko Hua smiled and replied cleverly, Since you didn't kill this gentleman, you won't kill me before he dies, right? Brando sighed. He was seen through again. Didn't they say that people with big breasts had no brains? Why was Ko Hua an exception? Could it be because the physiological structure of the dusk wolves was different from that of humans? He couldn't help but look at the girl lying quietly on the ice. She was wearing a thin robe, but she didn't seem to feel cold at all. Her chest was moving up and down slightly with her breathing. If her identity was ignored, this eldest daughter of Ekis was really like a goddess. At least her figure could be considered flawless. Even the loose black robe couldn't hide her graceful curves. Even a real goddess would be jealous of her. Brando looked at her and suddenly remembered the feeling he had before. His brain heated up and he quickly covered his nose, afraid that he would make a fool of himself. Ko Hua giggled like a young girl, as if she didn't care. Since there was no way to solve the problem here, Brando had to think of a way to figure out where he was. He only remembered the scene when he fell from the spiral hall, but no one knew what was below the abyss. It seemed that there were players in the game who went down, but there were intersecting glaciers below. In the center of the deadly frost forest, glaciers were everywhere. No one had the time to explore these large and small glaciers. And now it seemed like he was in the middle of these glaciers. These glaciers that had existed since ancient times were of different sizes. The large ones could span several miles, and the small ones were like the ice cavern he was in now. "Can I borrow your magic?" Brando turned and asked Ko Hua. Ko Hua nodded, and the ball of light quickly flew to his shoulder. Brando groped along the ice wall for a while. This long and narrow ice cavern stretched for dozens of meters and was made of blue ice. The ice surface sometimes reflected light, making the whole cavern look strange. But Brando walked around and couldn't find a way out. The entire ice cavern was completely sealed, and there was no way out even above his head. He checked again and finally gave up. He couldn't help but return to his original spot dejectedly. He also had some doubts. Was this place a sealed space? Then how did they fall here? Or was it the landslide caused by the collapse of the spiral hall that buried this place? If it was the second possibility, then it was a big problem. He clearly remembered that it was half a mountain wall. Who knew how thick it would be when it collapsed? And it was hard to say how much air there was in this ice cavern. Ko Hua saw him return and asked softly, "Mr. Human, are you looking for a way out?" Brando suddenly raised his head and looked at the eldest daughter of Ekis. He asked, "Do you know where this place is?" Ko Hua nodded. "This should be the bottom of the spiral hall, the god's eternal rest." The god's eternal rest? Brando chewed on the name and suddenly realized. This is the place where Sir Ash sleeps? Sir Ash. I'm talking about the awakening god, Brando replied. Ko Hua nodded again. So it's here. Brando suddenly understood. He looked at Ko Hua. You seem to know? I've always known, Mr. Human. Ko Hua replied. Actually, the awakening god is Milos. Although we fell into eternal sleep after that battle, it's just a saying. Just like how I can wake up, so can Milos. That's not right. Brando was a little confused. Shouldn't Milos be on our side? Then why did you go through so much trouble to revive him? Ignorance, Arek's voice interrupted. Brando looked back at him and understood that there must be some inside story. However, he did not expect the Duke to tell him, so he simply turned back to look at Ko Hua. Ko Hua smiled slyly. After the era of mortals, another god was born on the earth. This is not good news for you. And the key is that the one controlling Milos now is my other side. Brando frowned. He knew all this, but he felt that she was hiding something. There's a problem here. If I remember correctly, although Milos is only a frost giant god, his level is not lower than your mother's. And this is his home ground. Your other soul shouldn't be able to take over his place, right? Even if Milos has just woken up, it's still the same. Not to mention, Miss Ko Hua, that's only half of your soul. Under normal circumstances, that's true, Ko Hua replied. But Lord Milos' consciousness is not in his body. What? Brando was shocked. You mean the giant god has only woken up in his body? Ko Hua nodded. This was a big problem. Didn't this mean that this so-called Sir Ash was actually very similar to the dark side Ko Hua? But a vengeful descendant of the twilight controlling the corpse of a real god was no joke. If Milos' body only had its own power, it would be fine. If it also had the functions and territory of a god, then it would not be fun. However, Brando felt that since this was the boss of the holy cathedral of the hibernator, its strength should not be too outrageous. Of course, this could only be a beautiful wish. After all, history had changed. Besides, this was not a game. Who knew what would happen? I remember you call your other side sister? Brando suddenly said with lingering fear. Your sister doesn't seem to have a very good personality. Ko Hua looked at him awkwardly. Mr. Human. Of course, Brendel understood why Korfa felt awkward, because he was probably the only one here who was most familiar with the two sides of the same body. The kind-hearted Korfa was a pacifist through and through. It was said on the forum that her biggest wish was to be a gardener. Of course, no one knew where this strange saying came from, but it had a certain degree of credibility. And Korfa's sister was a true war maniac. The dark side of Korfa was the reason for this boss' existence, and she was bent on reviving the Twilight Dragon, which coincided with Arek's point of view. However, the dark side Ko Hua would occasionally be in a good mood. Perhaps she would not appear so manic, such as her behavior at the beginning of the hall. But this kind of thing was too illusory. Brando did not dare to gamble with this kind of thing. He looked at this sealed space. The first task now was naturally to find a way out, and the only way was to dig a way out. He could only pray that the ice above his head was not too thick, or that he was lucky enough to dig into an ice crevice. And because he did not know how much air there was in this ice cavity, he had to start immediately. But this matter obviously could not be done by him alone. He looked back at Arek and Ko Hua and asked, "You two don't want to die here together, right? P.S. Please vote."